The holy sword that once shone brilliantly in the hands of the sword saint was now displayed in the slums for 20 years with no one showing interest. Everyone believed it was just a broken sword, but the boy fell in love with it at first sight. He desperately wanted to buy it, yet even if he went without food or drink, 3,000 years of salary wouldn't be enough. Just then, the boy's childhood friend spoke up. "Idiot, if you like it, I'll buy it for you." The boy said, "But it's very expensive." The girl said, "It's just a broken sword, how expensive could it be?" The girl said with unusual determination, "Call me sister, and I'll pay for it in full." The boy stared at the holy sword and said, 5 gold coins. The atmosphere immediately became awkward, as Mina hadn't expected a broken sword to be so expensive. She held her chin and observed carefully, saying, 5 gold coins? That's enough for me to spend for 200 years. Fred could only laugh awkwardly at this, but just then, a rough and angry voice came from not far away. "What do you mean, broken sword? Get lost, this isn't a toy for you poor folks." As the words fell, a burly old man angrily rushed at the two of them. This person was the blacksmith shop owner, but Mina said calmly, "Old man, are you crazy? This is the slums. There are only poor people here." That seemed right. The old man was speechless. He could only angrily scold her for being rude. Mina wasn't about to back down either, cursing him back as an old geezer. Before they could come to blows, Fred quickly pulled Mina away, but the old man behind them was still indignant, because when the girl was nearly starving to death, he had given her food and saved her life. Why didn't she show him any gratitude? The old man walked angrily toward the blacksmith shop while thinking, but when he looked down, he actually saw the deep footprints in front of the holy sword. The old man sighed helplessly and said, "How long has he been standing here? But no matter how much you like it, I can't give you the sword. I know very well that people from the slums can never escape the slums, and my masterpiece is destined to shine before the whole world." It turned out the boy was just a candle-selling clerk at some hotel in the slums. His parents died early. He was taken in by the shop owner Sanji and treated like his own son. So to repay this kindness, Fred's salary was basically zero. But even so, he still worked wholeheartedly for this job. This day, hostile forces from the slums came looking for trouble. Fred looked up. The leader turned out to be One-Armed Jack. He was one of the 5 major forces in the slums. The other 4 were Knight Sanji, Butcher Black Bear, Gambler Tiz, Whaler Fowie. The most powerful was none other than Jack, who constantly thought about how to swallow the other 4 and monopolize the slums alone. So Jack came today under the guise of negotiation to cause trouble. He said, "Hey kid, where's your boss?" After hearing this, Fred didn't answer, just stared at Jack with determined eyes. Jack himself had come, "Should I fight or?" Before Fred could think, Jack's subordinate Xiaojia couldn't hold back and said, "You brat, didn't you hear what our boss said?" Fred answered without any emotion, "I don't know, I'm just a candle seller." Seeing this, Xiaojia flew into a rage, cursing continuously, and slapped the box full of candles, knocking the candles all over the floor. Seeing this, everyone present held their breath. A big fight seemed unavoidable, but Fred not only didn't get angry, he even bent down and started picking up the candles. Xiaojia was stunned, then trembled with anger. He said, "You brat, don't you understand the situation?" But Fred remained unmoved, even asked him to move his foot. At this moment, Xiaojia could no longer hold back. He directly lifted his foot and kicked viciously toward Fred. Fred quickly moved the stick to his right hand, then swept forcefully at Xiaojia's supporting leg, lifting him into the air, then assumed a stance. With full force, directly sent Xiaojia flying. This scene directly shocked everyone present, but Jack showed a meaningful smile, even stopped his angry subordinates. Jack said, "I like you very much, but I only have one hand, so I couldn't stop Xiaojia, please forgive me." But Fred said nonchalantly, "I don't discriminate against disabled people." Jack laughed heartily after hearing this, but the next second, Jack's expression changed 380 degrees. His whole body erupted with terrifying pressure, saying, "How about we talk privately?" However, Fred wasn't crushed by his pressure. His eyes remained as determined as ever. The atmosphere was tense for a few seconds. Fortunately, Sanji's voice suddenly rang out. "So it's Jack. Why didn't you tell me you were coming in advance? I could have prepared roast meat for you." Jack smiled after hearing this and said, "No need, we're not that close." Then Sanji stood in front of Jack, calmly inviting him upstairs to catch up, but secretly the two had already engaged in a battle of auras. Although Sanji was at a disadvantage, he still refused to back down. So in this situation, Jack had no choice but to agree to go up and chat. After they left, Fred's anxious heart finally calmed down. That was close, he almost died here. Although his life was saved, many candles were damaged. 2.5 hours later, Jack's group came down from the second floor. Jack said, "I'm good at reading people. Even your boss has the same opinion as me. If you're tired of the smell of candles, then come work for me." Hearing this, Fred helplessly touched his neck and said, "But they give me food, money, and even a place to sleep." Jack laughed and said, "We can give you these too." Then he flicked a gold coin to Fred, saying, "This is compensation for you." Fred received the gold coin in disbelief. This was the first time he'd seen a gold coin since birth. Jack said, "Come work for me. You can have as many gold coins as you want. When you've decided, come find me at the money house." Jack left the tavern after speaking. Fred behind him looked at the happy crowd and thought, this negotiation had gone smoothly. But unexpectedly, just a while later, he was called upstairs by Mina. In the room, everyone had gloomy faces, heads down and silent. Clearly the situation wasn't optimistic. After asking Fred to sit down, Sanji handed him a short knife, originally meant as a birthday gift. But now the situation was urgent. Previously, Jack's odds against Sanji were 50-50, although Jack had many subordinates. Sanji, as a retired knight, was also quite capable, so he could basically maintain the balance of power. But now Jack had actually found an active knight from outside the slums, breaking the balance. With no choice, Sanji had to stop Fred's candle-selling job, and gave him a mission that would determine the gang's life or death, to be executed in one day. Taking advantage of the free time, Fred quickly seized the opportunity to practice swordsmanship. He was satisfied with his powerful slashing, but a hollow voice rang out beside him. When you slash, you should reduce the angle of your elbow to increase power. Fred felt a bit helpless after hearing this. He didn't know where the voice came from, but it would only give pointers when he practiced sword. He only remembered that day when he was standing in front of the holy sword admiring it. A black lightning suddenly struck down from the sky and hit him, but it caused no harm. Only since then, every time he practiced sword, a voice would ring out. This time, Fred couldn't hold back anymore, so he tried to do as the voice said. He closed his eyes tightly, concentrated all his strength in his hands, then raised the stick and struck down with full force. After completing this series of movements, Fred was shocked. What powerful force was this? This was a feeling he'd never had before. Who was this guy? Why was he so familiar with swordsmanship? Actually, even he didn't know who he was. He only vaguely remembered knowing a little swordsmanship. But with his love for swordsmanship, even after death, his soul didn't dissipate. Instead, it attached to the holy sword, becoming a sword soul. 3 days later, Fred came outside the slums following the guidance. He was to bring back Sanji's old friend Stanga to help defend against Jack's group. Things went smoothly. Fred immediately found the legendary knight Stanga, then handed Sanji's letter to him. Stanga received the letter and began reading, learning of Sanji's urgent situation, but he smiled meaningfully. So you're being attacked by mercenary knights. No wonder you need my help. The situation was urgent. Fred didn't want to delay further. After briefly brushing him off, Fred began leading him on the journey, but Stanga sighed. I'm not even sure if I should follow you, you fool, Fred said, but at least I can show you the way, you understand. Stanga's face darkened after hearing this. If you take one wrong step, I'll kill you. Seeing the other party trying to intimidate him, Fred ignored it, saying, let's go quickly, I don't want to mess up my first mission. Stanga was stunned, thinking, this guy's reaction is really strange, no wonder Sanji likes him. Stanga stared at Fred and followed him. When night came, the two found a cave to rest, but Fred kept staring at Stanga's face. Stanga said, what? Never seen such a handsome knight? Fred said, right. Stanga said, you really are a country bumpkin. Fred said, where are you from? Stanga said, Dajia. Fred said, isn't that even more country bumpkin than a country bumpkin? Stanga was stunned, completely unable to find a reason to refute, so he threatened Fred again, better not get lost. Fred said, got it. Then he took out a row of fresh beef. Stanga said, is there a share for me? Fred said, no. Didn't you bring food? Then Stanga took out 2 pieces of jerky from his pocket and froze, looking at the fragrant roast beef in front of him. His mouth watered uncontrollably. He said, how about this? I'll answer one question for you. You give me 1 piece of beef. Fred was silent for a few seconds after hearing this, then said, if you want to eat beef, just say so. Stanga said, I have dignity. Knights don't take others' things for free. That's principle. Fred said, you're already retired. Stanga was stunned again after hearing this. This kid really had a sharp tongue. But Fred wasn't that petty. Still casually asked 2 questions. Name, age. Stanga said, Stanga, 42, cent. After a few seconds, Fred thought of another explosive question. Do you know aura? After hearing this, Stanga's mouth curved up smugly. Not every knight knows aura. Fred said, if you don't know, just say so. Stanga slowly stood up after hearing this and drew his sword. He held the sword in front of him and began meditating. After a moment, a blue beam of light enveloped Stanga. His eyes and his sword even showed deeper blue. When he opened his eyes, a powerful force emanated from him, almost knocking Fred over. So strong is this aura? Just looking at it made one's heart race. Time quickly came to 3 days later. The two successfully returned to the slums. Stanga suddenly noticed something strange. He said, it's so quiet here, so quiet it's disturbing me. Fred replied irritably, because it's night. Stanga said, really, is this place usually like this? He suddenly darkened his face. Before them were densely packed more than 30 corpses. Fred panicked. He hadn't expected Jack to launch an attack early. Then he quickly told Stanga the tavern's location and rushed back without looking back. The tavern was also in ruins. Fred felt something was wrong, but fortunately Sanji was only slightly injured. Sanji said, you brought him back, right? Fred said, yes, he should be arriving soon. Sanji's veins bulged after hearing this. Good, tomorrow we'll settle accounts with Jack. Then Sanji changed the subject. How's that guy been lately? Fred said, he's fine, he even demonstrated aura in front of me. Sanji was stunned after hearing this, showing an incredulous expression, and confirmed with Fred repeatedly, but still got the same result. Sanji thought to himself, not good. Everyone hide behind me, Stanga doesn't know aura at all. Fred was dumbfounded. If he's not Stanga, then who is he? After a moment, the white-haired man also arrived here. His eyes were full of killing intent. So you hid here, long time no see, Sanji. Sanji was shocked, quickly protected Fred behind him. Sanji said, after all these years, why won't you let me go? Godin poured a glass of Lafitte, said, when you disobeyed the Count's orders and chose to be a deserter, your death was sealed, even though the Count is dead now. Sanji flew into a rage after hearing this. I'm human, not the Count's killing machine. After speaking, he raised his sword and charged. In his anger, he used all his strength and slashed down fiercely, but was dodged by Godin. Sanji said, such fast speed. You used to ask me for sword instruction. Have you grown to this level now? But Sanji still refused to back down. One sword strike down was blocked by Godin's sword. Then, the two exchanged several more rounds, almost destroying everything around them, but couldn't harm him at all. Seeing this, Fred quickly protected the proprietress. After walking outside the hall, Fred said, everyone come. Up quickly, Sanji. Before Fred could finish speaking, Sanji was sent flying out, directly falling to the first floor. Following was Godin, like the Grim Reaper. Godin said, Sanji, won't you still go back? Then he slowly walked to the stairs, looking down at Sanji like an ant. Fred beside him saw him distracted, quickly pulled out a small knife and threw it, but was blocked by Godin. The ambushed Godin glanced at Fred sideways, but rushed toward Sanji without looking back. Sanji barely dodged the attack by turning sideways. At this moment, Godin's patience was completely exhausted. Godin said, knights should obey orders unconditionally, Sanji. After speaking, he closed his eyes, then held his sword in front of him. A blue pillar pillar of light wound around the sword blade. Fred felt something was wrong, quickly ran toward the first floor trying to stop Godin, but it was too late. When he opened his eyes, with one swing of his sword, countless blades burst forth, destroying everything within a 2-meter radius. Only the late arriving Fred was spared, but the powerful shockwave still brought him to his knees. When the smoke cleared, Fred saw a scene he would never forget in his lifetime. Sanji was dead. That strongest man, who always protected him, was dead. Fred's world collapsed instantly. He casually grabbed a sword nearby and charged recklessly. He randomly swung a slash, but Godin dodged sideways. Godin was somewhat surprised this poor kid actually knew swordsmanship. When he saw Fred raise his sword, he still mercilessly kicked toward Fred's vital point, directly kicking him away. But Fred didn't die. Just this powerful force almost made him unable to breathe. Godin thought, did his body instinctively twist to avoid the vital point? His talent might even be higher than mine. Killing him now would be too wasteful. Better to wait until later. Maybe he can be like me, even surpass the master. Who knows? Godin smiled, then said, knights only take what they deserve. I'm not Stanga and I'm not 42 years old. After speaking, he returned the 2 pieces of jerky to Fred. Godin continued, but I must take what's in my hands. This is my right as the victor. Fred barely heard any of Godin's words. He now had only one thought, that he must kill Godin. After the two looked at each other, Godin turned and left. Godin said, work hard to become stronger. 2 pieces of jerky aren't enough to buy my life. Fred gritted his teeth after hearing this, said, someday you'll die by my sword. After this, Fred kept squatting here, as if everything in the world had lost meaning. The proprietress, seeing this, directly slapped him, said, do you know the difference between people inside and outside the slums? People outside have countless chances to start over, but we only need to fail once, and almost everyone dies. After speaking, she grabbed Fred, said, you are our only hope, live well. After a while, Fred escaped with Mina, but now he was seriously injured and could barely walk. While the slums were full of Jack's subordinates, Fred wiped away his sweat, swearing he absolutely couldn't die here. But just then, Jack's subordinates actually discovered them. Xiao Jia raged, you two are dead. So the two, to avoid being hunted, desperately hid in a shop, to avoid implicating Mina. The injured Fred suggested they split up and escape, but Mina started being stubborn. After hearing this, she said, I want to be with you, no matter how much Fred begged. Mina became more stubborn, even began crying softly at the end, but refused to separate. Fred had a headache. Mina was being disobedient at this time, and their commotion was quite loud, just waking up the shop owner. Turning around, the owner had already come over with a lamp. It was the old man from the blacksmith shop. What are you doing here? Mina was stunned, hurriedly picked up a knife from the table, said, don't make a sound, old man. The old man rolled his eyes. Is this my house or yours? Why are you so righteous? Mina said, I said don't make a sound. Do I really have to stab you before you'll be quiet? Seeing Mina's serious expression, the old man had to give up. The old man said, I won't make a sound, put the knife down. Mina gritted her teeth, suddenly remembering the holy sword. Might as well go all in. She said, old man, hand over the sword you had hanging at the door. The old man was stunned after hearing this, refused her, because that sword was more important than his life. He could never give it to mediocre people. Fred also tried to stop Mina, but now she couldn't listen to anyone. Her mind had only one thought, that if she could help Fred get the holy sword, he could definitely leave here alive. Seeing the old man's firm attitude, Mina gritted her teeth, gripped the knife tightly, making a do-or-die gesture. Fred said, Mina, stop. Don't do anything foolish. The old man also closed his eyes, waiting for her to act. The next second, Mina swung the knife, but cut off her own red hair, said, I'll give you all this. I'll repay the rest with my lifetime. Please give Fred the sword. The old man was silent for a few seconds after seeing this, then turned his gaze to Fred, asking, do you want to leave the slums? After getting Fred's affirmative answer, the old man fell into thought, not to mention Fred's love for the sword, coming to admire the holy sword at his place every day. Besides, this kid really had some of that guy's style. Maybe he really could fulfill his wish. He was old, let this kid fulfill that wish. After a moment, the old man and Mina pushed a cart of garbage preparing to leave the city, while Fred was hiding inside with the holy sword, because Jack's subordinates had already sealed off the entire slums. This was the best way to escape. But although the old man was very careful, they were still discovered by a group of Jack's subordinates. They said, going to throw garbage so late. The old man directly cursed, it's because you guys fighting blocked all the alleys, so I couldn't throw the garbage. The thug was stunned. What a grumpy old man. Then he turned his gaze to Mina behind the cart, asking, who is she? Isn't your blacksmith shop just you alone? The old man continued roaring, I'm tired, can't I hire someone to help me? The thug thought, forget it. The old man is the only blacksmith in the slums, can't be too disrespectful to him. But he still pressed his sword against Mina's hat, and slashed upward, directly cutting the hat. Mina quickly made a face, plus she had already cut her hair. The thug really didn't recognize her. Alright, you can go. We're looking for that blonde kid from Sanji's place. The old man slowly pushed the cart and began to leave after hearing this. Just when they were about to escape, unexpectedly another black thug called out to the old man, said, wait, your garbage cart hasn't been inspected yet. Then he had the old man stop the cart to one side. Mina looked panicked because once the garbage cart was inspected, Fred would definitely be exposed. The black thug looked down, seemingly already aware that Fred was hiding inside. He said, this is my job, don't hate me. After speaking, he stabbed the stick hard into the garbage cart. Said, I heard that idiot Haven sailed the boat to the riverside. Everyone can leave from there. Then he pulled the stick out. Said, alright, you passed. It turned out the black man's brother had once been caught stealing, and to save him, Fred had spent all his 40 silver coins. So, to repay him, the black thug deliberately inserted the stick in the wrong place and told him how to leave the slums. Soon, several people arrived at the garbage station outside the city. Mina said reluctantly, goodbye, Fred. You must be safe. The boy held Starlight in his hands, forged with the old man's dreams, bought with the girl's tears, so starlight would definitely shine brilliantly in the boy's hands. Not long after Fred successfully escaped, he couldn't wait to take out the sword. Fred said, "You can hear me speak, right?" The sword soul's voice slowly rang out, "Yes." Fred continued asking, "Who exactly are you?" The sword said, "I don't know." Fred said, "Good, then I'll help you recover your memory. You become my sword, how about it? Even if you're a demon, I need your help." Because the blue knight who wiped out his entire team was really powerful. His strength was probably dozens of times above Sanji's. Seeing Fred's determined attitude, the sword soul's voice rang out, "Good, I'll teach you all my swordsmanship." After Fred escaped from the slums, he became a mercenary group leader, making a living by subjugating monsters. On one hand, it could increase combat experience, adding chips for the final revenge. On the other hand, sometimes there would be challenges. Just after everyone finished clearing the goblin minions, a giant goblin quietly appeared. One club strike viciously smashed toward the mercenary, directly flattening him. This powerful force made everyone afraid to act rashly. But the next second, the giant goblin rushed over at extremely fast speed. Another club strike knocked down 7 or 8 people. Then it let out a roar that shook the sky, directly crushing everyone's psychological defense. The mercenary shouted, "Run quickly, we're no match for this kind of monster." However, when the mercenary was escaping, he was killed by the employer with one sword. The employer said, "Hurry up and fight, deserters die." After speaking, he just looked up. The giant goblin's oppressive presence hit him in the face, making him break out in cold sweat. When everyone was in panic, a blonde young man slowly walked toward the goblin, his eyes full of determination. In just an instant, he drew his sword and slashed. The goblin couldn't react in time, but relied on its strong defense to take this hit head on. The sword soul's voice rang out, "Dodge." Fred leaped to avoid the counterattack, but was scolded by the sword soul, "You idiot. You couldn't kill it with one strike?" Fred felt helpless after hearing this, because not everyone had his kind of strength. After a moment, Fred attacked again, but was met with the goblin's fierce counterattack. He could only dodge, and dodge again, then seizing the gap after the goblin's attack. Fred concentrated, held his breath, swung a powerful slash. This time he didn't miss. One strike beheaded the goblin. The battle ended. This incident also reached the ears of the employer's superior, Knight Jaeger. He was very puzzled how a wet behind the ears kid could have this kind of strength, so he told Joseph about this. Joseph was the second son of Count Bayod's family, currently caught in a struggle with his brother for inheritance rights, so he desperately needed powerful swordsmen to help him. After learning about this, he rushed to the front lines without stopping. As soon as he arrived, a foul smell hit him. Jaeger said, "Young master, observe these goblins." Joseph looked at them one by one after hearing this. These goblins had neat wounds, each strike precisely hitting vital points. Joseph became more shocked as he looked. Could this all be done by the same person? Jaeger said, "Yes, it's the kid I told you about." Joseph's mouth curved up after hearing this. He's a genius. On the other side, Fred and the sword soul were arguing about one thing, whether to run away or not. Because Fred had killed a mercenary named Ramen, and impersonated his identity to enter the mercenary group. If discovered, identity fraud and murder were both capital crimes. The sword soul said sarcastically, "You really are a bad person." Fred retorted, "You're an accomplice too." But actually it was self-defense, though there were no witnesses. Just to be safe, Fred decided to escape tonight. But just then, a figure slowly approached from behind. Fred quickly assumed an attack stance after noticing. Jaeger said, "He noticed my presence? Really an impressive kid." But Jaeger still said emotionlessly, "Lord Joseph wants to see you." Fred hesitated for a while, then said, "This is my honor." Then Jaeger had Fred follow him. Fred asked carefully, "Should I run away?" But was warned by the sword soul, "Don't even try. A knight of his level will definitely kill you within 3 steps. After hearing this, Fred gave up the idea of escaping, obediently came to the commander's tent. Joseph spoke first. "Very pleased to meet you." Fred said carefully, "This is my honor, Lord Joseph." Joseph said, "Your name is Ramen." Fred bowed, "Yes." Unexpectedly, he was directly slapped. Joseph closed the book, then looked at Fred seriously. "I hate being lied to, Fred from Sola, but strangely we can't find any information about your father." Fred retorted, "That's really funny," but was kicked to the ground by Jaeger. Jaeger said, "Please mind your manners." Joseph said, "No need for that. A child from the slums, where exactly did you learn swordsmanship, tell me?" Joseph stared into Fred's eyes, quite displeased. Joseph said, "Your eyes hide too much." Jaeger behind him slowly drew his sword as if receiving an order. At this moment, Fred knew he couldn't hide anything anymore. So Fred said, "I have a teacher living in my mind, who comes out to teach me when I practice swordsmanship." Joseph looked at Fred's determined eyes and didn't see any signs of lying. Joseph said, "All right, I'm sorry for being so rude to you just now." Then Joseph completely changed his attitude. "Do you want power, money, and beautiful women? Then become my knight." However, when Fred sparred with Jaeger, Fred was steadily losing ground, facing Jaeger's sharp swordsmanship and powerful force. He had almost no way to respond. Others mocked, "Sir Jaeger is already trying his best to go easy. If this were real combat, he would have been sliced to ribbons long ago." Even so, after Fred took hundreds of sword strikes, he gradually began to adapt to the rhythm. After blocking one attack, he used the force to press his sword back, then quickly slashed forward. Although blocked by Jaeger, this scene made everyone cheer. This progress speed truly worthy of a genius. From being unable to fight back to swinging the first sword, it only took a few hundred lives. Then Jaeger also stopped training. Practiced twice in the morning and evening from now on. After speaking, he turned and left. Fred was dumbfounded, thinking, after practice, he doesn't give me any advice? The sword soul said, "Getting beaten is the best way to grow. His swordsmanship left you almost no room to think. You could only rely on muscle muscle memory to counterattack. He's a good teacher. Fred said, even you won't take my side. Not long after, Jaeger returned to the commander's tent, then reported the training results to Joseph. He believed Fred was talented but arrogant and not worth cultivating. Moreover, he wasn't willing when he joined, so loyalty was also a big problem. Joseph smiled after hearing this. I believe you can teach him manners. As for loyalty, mutual use will actually make our relationship more solid. He wants to become stronger, and we can help him do that. This will also keep him firmly imprisoned by us. Hearing this, Jaeger couldn't say much more. That night, Mercenary Goad was standing guard by the camp. The cold weather made him shiver, so he secretly decided to curry favor with team leader Fred to get better advancement opportunities. Just when he was distracted, a knight suddenly appeared before him, but fortunately they just exchanged a few pleasantries. Then the knight turned and left. Goad watched his retreating figure, then closed his eyes, preparing to have a good sleep. But suddenly a stern rebuke woke him up. What are you doing here? Soon the knight spoke again. No, I'm not your child, you crazy woman. Goad stared dumbfounded at the distant knight talking to himself. Who was he talking to? Without thinking much, Goad slowly approached step by step. When the two were less than 10 steps apart, the knight suddenly walked quickly in one direction, but that wasn't toward the army camp. Just when Goad was puzzled, he suddenly saw a ghostly shadow wrapped around the knight. In another blink, the ghost had turned into an unmade-up woman. The next morning, Fred came down from the early shift covered in aches. He said, can't that guy be a little more lenient with me? The sword soul said, this is teaching others can only dream of. Fred said, he looks like he just purely wants to beat me up. Just when the two were bantering as usual, someone suddenly called Fred from behind. Captain, come here quickly. Goad was hiding behind a tree sneakily, then looked around to avoid being discovered, because he had decided to escape tonight. Then he told Fred what he saw last night, and advised him to escape together. But Fred didn't believe it at all, thinking he was making excuses for being a deserter, then raised his hand to hit him. Goad said, I'm telling the truth, even Knight Roderick disappeared yesterday. Hearing this, Fred slowly began to believe. Goad said, our army has always had deserters, but actually they didn't desert. They were killed by female ghosts, and they all have one common trait, that is black hair. But soon Goad regretted saying this, because Fred not only didn't escape with him but reported the whole thing. Now he had to lead the search for missing personnel. Jaeger felt uneasy, because Joseph also had black hair, so he wanted to stay by Joseph's side. But considering that even a strong fighter like Knight Roderick had disappeared, he had to step forward. Soon several hours of searching passed, but there were still no clues. Helplessly, Jaeger could only order his subordinates to continue searching. In a blink, evening came. Goad was indignant about Fred's behavior. I kindly advised you to leave together. How could you treat me like this? Fred said, continue searching, don't chat, I'll give you something later. Just when the two were talking, Jaeger nearby said, did you find anything? Fred shook his head. Jaeger said, you're really useless. How do you find people on the streets? Fred said, just grab someone and beat them up, they'll tell you. Hearing this answer, Jaeger was speechless. Jaeger thought, it's getting dark now, should I call them back? Just when Jaeger was thinking, a river in front caught his attention. Upon learning that the other side hadn't been explored, he immediately ordered Goad to gather the mercenaries, preparing to cross the river to search the other side. But Jaeger found the ice surface didn't seem very solid, so he ordered his subordinates to cross in groups of 3, dispersing across the river. Soon the mercenaries began crossing one after another. Only Fred and Goad were left, but Goad felt uneasy and was reluctant to cross. He said, my sixth sense tells me we absolutely can't go over there. Fred said, no, you're just scared. Goad retorted, of course I'm scared. I don't have your great strength. Fred said, so you want to be a deserter? That won't end well either. Fred suddenly stared at him seriously. Goad was startled by these words. Under Fred's repeated demands, he still took the first step forward, but his legs immediately went weak. Then he collapsed on the ice surface. It was this action that let him see a scene he would never forget in his lifetime. At the same time, Light Priest Andre was praying, but suddenly discovered the holy water was wrapped in eerie black shadows. Sensing something terrible, he quickly reported this to Joseph. This was scripture written with sacred ink, yet the text on it writhed like ants on a hot pan. This sudden eerie phenomenon meant there were fierce evil spirits nearby. Seeing this, Joseph was terrified inside. Although Andre possessed divine power, facing such fierce demons he could probably only temporarily suppress them. And now Jaeger, who could use light aura, wasn't at the camp. Joseph could only rely on the few remaining knights to fight desperately. After a moment of silence, he didn't hesitate and directly led everyone to face the enemy head-on. However, the camp was already shrouded in black smoke. All mercenaries with black hair began showing symptoms of mental disorder. Seeing this, everyone quickly took protective measures to avoid inhaling the black smoke. But just then, a bone-chilling aura made them instantly tremble. In the distance, a female ghost with a hideous face suddenly appeared. When she noticed Joseph's presence, she actually stopped in her tracks. Then she twisted her head 720 degrees and let out a spine-chilling laugh. She said, so there you are, my child. In this critical moment, Andre quickly unleashed his holy power to block the ghost's path. At this moment, Joseph finally understood completely that this was a malicious curse carefully designed with him as the target. Who exactly wanted to harm me? Meanwhile, Fred was engaged in fierce combat with the undead. Although his swordsmanship had improved greatly through recent sparring sessions, the undead came like a tide. Even killing 10 with one strike couldn't finish them all. Moreover, he had to protect the weak Goad while fighting. This quickly exhausted what little strength he had left. At this moment, Jaeger in the center of the lake was also trapped in a bitter struggle. The undead became extremely violent at night, and many mercenaries died horribly at their hands. Jaeger was overwhelmed and simply couldn't look after everyone. But what worried him most at this moment was Lord Joseph's safety. Without further hesitation, he directly released his aura power. A slash emanating green radiance swept out unstoppably. Instantly, the undead that had been frantically attacking him were cut to pieces. Jaeger shouted, "Fred, fulfill your contract." Hearing Jaeger's call, Fred quickly responded, "What should I do now?" Jaeger said, "Return to camp immediately to protect Lord Joseph. You must hold on until I get back." Upon hearing this, Fred rushed back to camp without stopping. Suddenly, Jaeger sensed a terrifying aura from behind. When he saw who it was, he couldn't help but feel extremely troubled. It was actually Sir Roderick, who had become one of the undead. Meanwhile, the situation on Joseph's side was also dire. Two knights had already been eroded by the curse and fallen unconscious. At this moment, the female ghost was about to break through the sacred barrier. The enormous energy consumption caused the assistant priest to cough up large amounts of blood. Although, under Andre's encouragement, the assistant priest quickly reinforced the barrier again. This method of overdraining one's life force could only buy a few moments. Tonight was too difficult for me to endure. I probably wouldn't live to see tomorrow's sun. Thinking this, Joseph seemed to accept fate's arrangement, but suddenly he looked ahead in disbelief. Fred was rushing toward them with his sword in hand. Actually, he had already reached the camp 2.5 minutes earlier, but the sword soul told him not to act rashly, because that thing was a moving curse. Ordinary swords couldn't completely destroy it. The only way was to use aura power, so the sword soul needed to possess Fred's body. But this method also required paying a huge price. That was that Fred's body would fall into a temporary state of paralysis. After pondering for a moment, Fred's eyes gradually became resolute. Fred said, "I promised Joseph I would give my life, not loyalty, and I still have something I must accomplish." Then the sword soul began to possess Fred's body, and instantly a powerful aura burst forth. But just when Fred thought this attack would succeed, the female ghost suddenly let out a sharp shriek. In that instant, Fred saw her memories from when she was alive. Fortunately, the sword soul quickly reminded him to close his eyes. This allowed him to successfully summon the voice world deep within his soul. Next, Fred's aura changed dramatically, and countless bolts of lightning enveloped his entire body. As a sword light cut through the void, the female ghost also suffered heavy damage under this terrifying power. But at this moment, Fred appeared to be in extreme pain. Overusing power beyond his body's limits made him scream wildly. Seeing the female ghost slowly crawling toward Fred, Joseph had no time to marvel and quickly rushed forward to rescue him. But just as he was helping Fred move forward with difficulty, he was grabbed by the ankle by the female ghost. No matter how he struggled, he couldn't break free. In this moment of crisis, the fat knight stepped forward. Using all his strength, he threw both men toward the safe zone. Joseph successfully survived this ordeal. After resting for a moment, Fred's body also recovered. Fred said, "Father Priest, please bless my sword." Upon hearing this, Andre directly cut open his palm. His blood contained absolute holy power, so the effect would be more significant. Then Fred dragged his weary body, wanting to end all of this. However, when he walked in front of the female ghost, his expression appeared very sorrowful, because in the female ghost's memories, he had seen the women imprisoned in the dark dungeon below, and the filthy corpses of children. Those soul-piercing cries left Fred's heart in turmoil. Perhaps only the end of life could bring her peace. As Fred thrust the sword imbued with divine power into her body, her soul was completely purified. Her appearance also returned to how she looked when alive. At this moment, the first ray of dawn illuminated the white snow-capped mountains. This great mother could finally see her child again. Meanwhile, the dark sorcerer who had been controlling from the shadows also sensed something. The evil thoughts had been lively and active just moments ago, but now they suddenly dissipated in an instant. Wasn't the intelligence that there was only one knight who could use aura? Thinking this, he immediately prepared to flee. But just then, a voice came that made him tremble instantly. Jaeger Knight was staring at him with burning anger. Moments later, Jaeger brought his severed head before Joseph. He said, "This wooden box contains the corpse of an infant. The dark sorcerer used this object to control that mother." Upon hearing this, Joseph immediately arranged for personnel to thoroughly investigate this matter. 3 days later, Fred woke from his coma with disheveled hair. He hadn't expected the backlash from aura power to be so severe. He would need to use it more carefully in the future. When he came outside the tent, he discovered the mercenary squad had already left. Only Gode, who always thought about deserting, remained here. Then Fred went to the main tent to talk with Joseph. The female ghost incident made Joseph appreciate the young man before him even more. Although they only had a verbal contract, Fred still chose to fulfill it fearlessly. This made Joseph eager to possess this genius. Then he expressed his gratitude for Fred's life-saving grace. Joseph said, "Now it's time for me to fulfill the contract. Regarding this incident, I will give you the reward you deserve, and I formally invite you here to join the Bayode family." The next day, they set off to return to the capital Sturmgard. Moments later, Joseph truthfully reported the female ghost incident to his father. Learning that a dark sorcerer dared to disturb the Bayode family's territory, the Count's face instantly became extremely grim. He immediately ordered elite troops to investigate who was behind this. The Count said, "Anyone who dares threaten my son must be made to feel pain worse than death." Meanwhile, Fred came to the religious center as agreed. After brief pleasantries, Andre handed something very important to Fred. Seeing this, Fred immediately showed complete disbelief. This was actually the identity card he had dreamed of obtaining, and the guarantor written on it was clearly Priest Andre. Thus, this homeless youth finally recorded his name in this vast world. From now on, Fred would completely escape his slum identity. Soon, night fell. Joseph arranged for Gode to work in the Bayode family family stables. Next came discussing the contract issue with Fred. Joseph said, "Although you've decided to draw your sword and charge for me in the future, you once said you had something you must do. I believe the implication of those words is that you need freedom. We must clarify this matter before we can continue discussing. So what exactly do you want to do after gaining freedom?" Hearing this, Fred's eyes suddenly became sharp. Half a year had passed, but he had never forgotten that enemy who killed Sanji, who was also the Aura Knight he so admired. Fred said, "Do you know a knight like Blue Moonlight named Godin?" Upon hearing this, Joseph regretfully expressed that he was also powerless. After all, Godin was Count Geidel's trusted minister. But as compensation, Joseph changed the contract term to 7 years. During this period, he would provide Fred with food, clothing, and shelter, and train him to become an outstanding knight who would excel anywhere. Additionally, Mina at the convent would receive better care. Fred only needed to obey Joseph's commands unconditionally. The next day, Jaeger took Fred to his residence and warned him never to do anything that would damage Joseph's reputation, as the attendants here were usually from wealthy families, so getting along would be difficult to adapt to. As for training, it would still be sparring twice daily, morning and evening. Just then, Joseph's mother Oksana unexpectedly appeared here. Looking at her still charming noble lady appearance, even the proprietress of a pleasure house couldn't compare. This made the simple-minded Fred immediately blush. Oksana had come to thank her son's savior. She then placed her hand on Fred's shoulder. She said, "Your golden hair and blue eyes really match well. If you were a bit stronger, you'd look much better. I'll make you a set of clothes soon." Upon hearing this, Fred nervously expressed his gratitude. Then Oksana left this place. Seeing this, Fred finally breathed a sigh of relief. After all, he had never seen such a charming noble lady in the slums. This made Jaeger couldn't help but tease, "I didn't expect you to show such a shy expression." But actually, Jaeger was also particularly nervous when facing Oksana. After this small episode, Fred went to the dining hall to eat. But unexpectedly, trouble came so quickly. A group of attendants approached him with ill intentions. Then, the leader Sovaning acted maliciously. He directly spat a thick glob of phlegm into Fred's bowl. Sovaning said, "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. I smelled something foul and thought this was a trash can." As soon as he said this, his lackeys burst into laughter. Seeing this situation, Fred remained silent throughout. He calmly picked the phlegm out of his bowl, then continued eating his breakfast as if nothing happened, because Jaeger had warned him not to do anything that would damage Joseph's reputation. So Fred was thinking about how to beat them up openly and justly. Watching his composed manner, Sovaning felt very displeased, but the dining hall was crowded. He couldn't make too big a scene either, so he could only find another opportunity to teach this unlucky guy a lesson. However, just then, Fred asked for his name with a grim face. This terrifying oppressive feeling instantly made him break out in cold sweat all over. Then Sovaning blurted out his name. Fred said, "Sovaning, right? I'll remember you." A week later, the Count came to the training ground to observe the attendants' training results. He quickly noticed the golden-haired boy that Joseph had taken in. Meanwhile, Jaeger was also secretly observing Fred. This instantly ignited the Count's interest. Let's see what his abilities are like then. In the training ground, Fred was grimly preparing for battle, because his opponent was one of Sovaning's lackeys. With his exceptional talent and recent training, Fred maintained a dominant advantage throughout. Continuous attacks left his opponent only able to defend passively. As the battle entered its intense phase, Fred used his eyes to mislead his opponent's attack direction. Then with swift steps, he dodged the wooden sword swinging down. When Sovaning's lackey realized he had fallen into a trap, Fred's powerful attack had already followed. The tremendous force sent him flying several meters away. Then Fred grimly grabbed Sovaning's lackey's hair, said, "Yesterday in the dining hall you laughed the loudest." With that, Fred threw a punch, striking directly at his face. Even so, Fred still didn't intend to let it go easily. He clenched his fist and frantically pounded Sovaning's lackey. Seeing this scene, the Count didn't stop it. After all, to become an excellent knight, one must possess the fighting spirit that makes enemies fear. Meanwhile, Jaeger also showed a satisfied expression. Back in the training ground, Sovaning's lackey had completely fallen unconscious. Only then did Fred leave with satisfaction. Then he came before Sovaning, said, "Once I enter combat, I always can't come to my senses, so please help me apologize to that guy. But I won't let this end just because I beat up a lackey. If the soup isn't salty enough, I'll come find you, and then you can spit some more saliva for me." Upon hearing this, Sovaning was so frightened by his terrifying aura that he froze in place, with beads of sweat soaking his clothes. Lord Joseph brought back a mad dog from the back alley. Then Fred went to the dining hall to eat, while Gode was still worried whether Fred would be expelled for fighting. Fred was completely unconcerned. That was just normal sparring between attendants, not to mention that he challenged me first. After hearing this, Gode felt relieved, just as the two were chatting. A little fat boy suddenly spoke, "My name is Portly." After saying this, he began to stammer. Fred found it annoying and told him to sit down and talk. Portly was immediately surprised upon hearing this. He was very grateful that Fred let him sit here. Then Portly saw the sausage in Fred's hand. He said proudly, "This is supplied by my father. I can share sausages with you." Fred was about to say, "Do you think I'll protect you just because you do this?" But the next second, the dazzling array of sausages before him was truly shocking. Fred was stunned for 3 seconds before reacting. Then said, "We're all attendants. Let's get along well from now on." Of course, it's not because of the sausages. The next day, Jaeger was preparing to train Fred. At this time, Gregory called out to him. After some pleasantries, he got to the point. Gregory said, "Can you get Fred to get closer to Portly? After all, Portly is my nephew, and I can't let him get bullied every day. I can't ask others for this favor, so I can only ask you." Jaeger asked, "Is it free?" Gregory replied, "Of course not. If this matter is resolved smoothly, I'll let you call on me for free once in the future." juncture, Jaeger said nothing more. Actually, even without Gregory asking, Fred would get closer to Portly anyway. After all, he could get free sausages. On the other side, in the stables, Goad was still teasing Fred about wanting to become a knight but not even knowing how to ride a horse. Fred was also helpless. After all, for a long time now, normal animals would show fearful expressions when they saw Fred, as if they had seen a ghost. But that day, he had successfully mounted a horse. Goad explained, "That's because Sir Jaeger's horse is particularly expensive. If it weren't for the critical situation then, we probably wouldn't have been able to ride it." After hearing this, Fred fell into thought. Just then, a maid walked over and said, "Lady Oksana requests your presence." Both were stunned for a moment. Sometime later, in Lady Oksana's main hall, Fred had already changed into a new set of clothes hand-sewn by Oksana. Lady Oksana said it suited Fred very well, and she would make him another set when summer came. Fred shyly expressed his gratitude, and then slowly left. Looking at the clothes he was wearing, Fred couldn't help but become thoughtful. Just as he looked toward the window beside him, he actually saw a group of people beating up Portly. His expression also changed from relaxed to serious. It seemed tonight wasn't suitable for wearing these clothes. Then he changed into old clothes and knocked on Portly's door. Portly opened the door, revealing his bruised and swollen face. Fred was stunned for a moment. Then he told Portly to give him the whole ham behind him. Portly's face fell upon hearing this, but he still took out the ham and handed it to Fred. Fred told Portly not to feel too wronged, because this was his deserved payment. Then Fred came to the training ground, which was already packed with people. Looking at the aggressive crowd, Fred showed a fierce expression. It seemed blood would be shed today. Next, Fred wielded his sword randomly in the crowd, beating everyone until their heads were bloody. Seeing this, Sovaning was shocked. This was simply a mad dog. Then he ordered everyone not to retreat and all charge forward. Before he finished speaking, Fred had already moved to Sovaning's front. Seeing this, Sovaning quickly swung his sword. But his swordsmanship was completely without method, and Fred easily dodged. Then Fred swung his sword. Sovaning was directly hit, but this was just the beginning. Fred swung his sword again. Sovaning was no match and fell directly to the ground, still crying out in pain. But this didn't earn Fred's sympathy. Fred then thrust his sword down. Sovaning was greatly alarmed, thinking, "This guy isn't gonna kill me, is he?" With a crack, Sovaning cried out. Everyone was startled, but looking over, the wooden sword had only grazed past Sovaning's ear. Fred threatened, "Don't make eye contact with me from now on, and don't bully the fat kid anymore." Sovaning nodded in fear. Then Fred stood up and looked at the crowd. Everyone was scared into cold sweats. Then came sounds of painful wailing. The next day, the Knights Hall held its monthly meeting. The team split into two lines. Those supporting Rutger stood in one line. Those supporting Joseph and those remaining neutral stood on the other side. At the front, standing between the two lines, was the Knight Commander. Sometime later, the meeting ended perfectly, and everyone walked out of the Great Hall, looking at the furious expressions of Rutger's knights. Jaeger turned and smiled faintly. After all, yesterday Fred had beaten up their attendants. The others didn't want to deal with him and turned to leave. Jaeger didn't pay them much attention either. Just as he returned to the hall, a set of exquisite armor appeared before his eyes. Joseph said this was a gift from Lord Count. Even Jaeger was stunned. After all, earning Lord Count's appreciation was truly not easy. Moreover, this armor was made from gray half-orcs. Seeing the scene, Joseph smiled with satisfaction. Then he took out an envelope and said, "It's time for the next step of the plan. We're setting off for Derma." The next day, the large force was traveling on the road. Joseph explained to Fred, "Derma is rich in various fruits and is also one of the gateways to the central region. This is crucial for the northern people. Currently, the Heinar family is experiencing succession disputes. Our purpose on this trip is to help the legitimate heir regain his position. We can use this opportunity to make the Heinar family owe us a big favor." Only then did Fred realize, saying, "So that's why you're having Sir Jaeger take action?" Then he turned to look at Jaeger. Jaeger noticed this impolite gaze. He said angrily, "How did I end up teaching an idiot like you who still can't even ride a horse?" Fred tried to explain, "Maybe I can ride expensive horses." Hearing this, Jaeger became even angrier, saying, "You want to ride expensive horses? More like the horse should ride you." Suddenly, Fred's heart began beating violently. He felt like something bad was about to happen. Before he could think more, the ground began to shake. Seeing the situation, Fred quickly kicked open the carriage door, then protected Joseph under his body. But Joseph told him not to panic too much. This was just a deathworm moving underground. Deathworms were also called remnants of fallen dragons. Hearing this name, Fred also smiled slightly, fantasizing about having such a cool title himself someday. Then several people continued forward and finally arrived at the city of Derma. After entering the city, Joseph told Fred to go see for himself, preferably to secretly observe the knights warm to up matches and learn something if possible. Fred understood, so this was what seeing for himself meant. Jaeger on the side added, "You'd better not get killed by some knight." After saying this, both men left, so Fred began wandering around. The sword soul suddenly said, "I think I've been here before. I have an impression of those trees on the mountain over there." Fred understood, saying, "You teach me swordsmanship, I help you recover your memories. It seems we have another place to pray in the future." Then Fred came to the hillside. He first respectfully paid his respects to the tomb's owner, and brushed away the accumulated fallen leaves. Then he drew his sword, thrust it straight into the ground and began to pray. The sword soul seemed to remember something. He seemed to have come here with someone before, when the tree wasn't this tall. At this time, the sword soul seemed to sense something. Then he controlled Fred's consciousness and looked carefully. He saw a giant python coiled around the tree. The sword soul explained this was a spirit. Fred suddenly understood. No wonder he didn't feel fear, but rather a hint of warmth. Just then, footsteps came from behind. The sword soul immediately disappeared. The woman was plainly dressed, but this didn't affect her beauty at all. Fred quickly sheathed his sword and explained, "Sorry, I was just looking for a quiet place to pray and unknowingly came here." Then he took out his identity card. The woman carefully examined it and found no problems. Then she stared blankly at Fred. Fred broke the silence first, saying, "You're a maid here, right? Can we make a deal? I'll help you clean the tomb, but you don't spread word about this." After all, Fred was still afraid of Jaeger's anger. While the woman was thinking, Fred directly grabbed the cleaning equipment. The woman smiled faintly, then said proudly, "That depends on how hard you work." Fred was helpless and could only sigh. Beautiful women were indeed scary. Watching Fred working hard at cleaning, the woman was also amused by this scene. The next day, at the Hainar family training ground, Fred was hiding in the shadows at this time, secretly watching the knights spar. As he watched, Fred began to wonder. They were all knights. Why was Bolden's level so low? Sometime later, the day of the duel finally arrived. Fred was organizing equipment for Jaeger. Then he caught a glimpse from the corner of his eye. He saw Endry, who wanted to usurp the position. Jaeger advised him, "Don't get distracted. Night battles aren't something you can easily see, although I don't know what you saw yesterday. Start with the basics." After the guidance, Fred also relaxed a bit. Just then, the door opened. A dignified and beautiful woman entered. Lady Alicia entered. Seeing who it was, Fred thought, "This is bad. Yesterday I seem to have called her a maid." Just as Alicia passed by Fred, she glanced over. She looked at Fred with an expressionless face. Fred was instantly scared into cold sweats by this scene. Then Alicia sat on the throne. The priest also announced the start of the duel. The 6 knights also looked at each other. In the first match, because Knight Duncan was old and frail, he was quickly beaten and covered in wounds. Fortunately, Alicia couldn't bear it and chose to surrender in the first match. Duncan never expected that the person he had trained would backstab his own lord. He truly had no face to meet the old master. The second match was Jaeger's turn. The 2 men were immediately aggressive upon meeting. Then Jaeger gripped his sword tightly, ready to strike. For this kind of central wild boar, Jaeger didn't even need to take it seriously. He could dodge attacks just by casually moving his body. To outsiders, it looked like Colin was suppressing Jaeger, but experts could tell that Jaeger was just toying with his opponent. Then Colin used both hands with force and swung his sword at Jaeger. Jaeger was completely calm. He directly used the counterattack technique. Counterattack technique, as the name suggests, forcibly twists the opponent's attack, causing the enemy to expose weaknesses. After this technique was used, Sir Colin could only surrender helplessly. After all, they weren't even on the same level. Upon hearing victory, Alicia also breathed a sigh of relief. The third match was Juviel against Barbaro. Barbaro came on aggressively saying, "I am Barbaro of Arghanistan." Juviel looked very relaxed. Then he looked toward Alicia nearby. Alicia looked confused. The next second, Juviel bowed and said, "I decide to forfeit this duel." Everyone was stunned upon hearing this. Only then did Joseph realize he had been played. Meanwhile, Endry laughed loudly and declared his victory. Joseph was naturally displeased and immediately said, "Our family will not agree to this kind of duel." After hearing this, several people began discussing among themselves, as they didn't want to go to war with them. Endry backed down, saying, "Do you still have anyone who can replace Juviel?" Joseph remained calm, then pointed to Fred, who was watching from the side. Endry said angrily, "He's just an attendant, I don't agree. Having an attendant fight would only disgrace the family name." Hearing this, Joseph's anger surged toward everyone, saying, "And what you're doing doesn't disgrace the family name?" Everyone's thoughts were exposed, and their bodies trembled, so they could only reluctantly agree to Joseph. After all, what waves could a mere attendant make? Then Fred prepared to enter, but Joseph called out to him. Then Joseph hugged him and whispered, 10 minutes. You just need to hold on for 10 minutes. After hearing the order, Fred immediately said, "Don't worry, I'll do my best." Fred walked before Alicia and bowed, then turned to face Barbaro directly. Barbaro said, "You're not qualified to make me introduce myself." Then he threw away his shield, drew a long sword, and declared he would crush Fred's arrogance. Fred wasn't intimidated but faced the difficulty head-on. Both men were at sword point, but Barbaro's strength was too great, and Fred was directly knocked back. Fortunately, the sword soul revealed Barbaro's weakness was his shoulder. Otherwise, Fred would have been defeated within 2 moves. Even Barbaro was shocked. This kid was truly gifted. His eyes were like those of a hungry wolf. Although very imposing, there was still a vast difference between knights and attendants. Fred was directly suppressed and forced to kneel. Then Barbaro struck again with his sword. Fred was directly knocked flying and crashed heavily into the wall. Barbaro said, "You're excellent, but still far from enough." With that, he raised his sword to give Fred the final blow. At this critical moment, Fred swung his sword forward, deflecting Barbaro's attack. Everyone was shocked, because what he used was actually the counterattack technique. At this time, Fred's consciousness began to gradually fade. He was mumbling something under his breath. Barbaro noticed something abnormal. This was dreaming of some consciousness from memory. In his mind's consciousness, the youth stood blankly in the extremely dark back alley. But what he yearned for was the town radiating brilliant light. Then his consciousness returned to normal, and his will became even more determined. Brilliant flowers also bloomed on the youth before his eyes. Then their attacks continued clashing, even though both hands were bloody and mangled. His unyielding will made him get up again and again. At this time, Barbaro seemed to see something and was stunned for a second. Fred's sword began to tremble uncontrollably, making buzzing sounds. Barbaro immediately realized this kid was about to bloom. "Then I'll fulfill my duty as a knight." Then he began attacking fiercely, just to awaken the light that was about to awaken within the youth. Suddenly, an aura burst from Fred's sword. Everyone simultaneously thought this was the precursor. Barbaro hurriedly shouted, "Give me the shield." Then said seriously, "I am Barbaro of Arghanistan. Youth who has gained qualification, state your name." Fred had already entered his own world at this time. Looking at the glorious city before him, Fred finally realized he had gained qualification. Then a ray of light gradually condensed in his left eye, and he shouted, "I am Fred of Digia." In an instant, brilliant light bloomed. Barbaro also gave the highest respect and activated his own aura. The two energies instantly collided. When the light faded, Barbaro looked at the youth before him with satisfaction. Joseph and Jaeger immediately expressed their gratitude to Barbaro. Barbaro said this was what he should do, and he was also honored to witness a newly bloomed flower. Then Joseph turned to the priest and said, "Since Fred awakened his aura in this duel, in this case the rules of sacred duels would conflict with the Swordmaster's code." The priest was stunned. Clearly this problem had stumped him. At this time, Joseph suggested the duel be suspended. The next day, within the Heinar family, Fred lay weakly in bed, as if all his bones had fallen apart. He quickly asked someone nearby for a glass of water, but the person before him was actually Joseph. Fred immediately became alert. He hurriedly took the glass of water, then said he was fine now. Hearing that Fred was okay, Joseph said, "Thanks to you awakening your aura this time, this way the sacred duel rules would conflict with the Swordmaster's code." Fred was stunned for a moment. After saying this, Joseph got up to leave. That afternoon, Alicia complained in her room, "Damn, Endre actually snuck away. How annoying." Duncan replied, "Endre no longer poses a threat to the family. The main thing now is to completely control Derma." While speaking, Alicia seemed to notice something. She asked Duncan, "Don't knights usually ride horses?" Duncan was stunned for a moment, then said, "Of course, you can't be called a knight if you can't ride a horse." Alicia said, "Then it's true that when God opens one door, he closes another." It turned out that downstairs, Fred was struggling to practice horse riding, but the horse didn't want to give Fred any face and directly shook Fred off. Seeing this situation, Jaeger asked, "Didn't you say you could ride expensive horses?" Fred was also puzzled, saying, "Maybe I need even more expensive horse." After saying this, he was punched in the head by Jaeger. Then he realized things seemed quite serious, saying, "I need to find the reason." Then Jaeger told Fred not to practice today, saying he had to handle some matters. Then he turned and left. Fred could only sigh helplessly. Then he looked toward the giant tree nearby and decided to go see it once more. Sometime later, Fred came under the giant tree with his sword. Then he thrust the sword into the ground. The sword soul also successfully possessed him. As soon as he looked up, he saw the white snake appear before him. This scared Fred so much he almost let go of his sword. Then the white snake circled around Fred, and even smiled at the end. The sword soul explained, "Don't try to understand spirits. After all, they're on another side of the world." At this time, the white snake howled toward the sky. Light also emanated from the surroundings. Fred only felt a warmth in his body, like being held by his mother. The sword soul was also incredulous, saying this was the spirit's blessing. The next day, Joseph and his group were also preparing to return. Alicia first thanked Joseph for his help, then told Fred to step forward. Fred was stunned for a moment. With both their consent, he walked forward. Then, seeing Fred kneel down, Alicia began to say, "I sincerely thank you, Fred. If it weren't for you, there would be no me today. So I decide to entrust my name to you. Although you're not a knight, you were more glorious than a knight that day." Fred looked at the handkerchief before him, not knowing whether to accept it, but he remembered being scolded by Jaeger before, simply because he didn't accept Rutger's peanuts. Thinking of this, he accepted the handkerchief with both hands. Everyone was shocked. Joseph and the other also remembered that Fred hadn't received education about the noble world. Duncan nearby quickly said, "You can't accept it like that. Usually when a woman offers a handkerchief, it symbolizes two meanings. First is to hang it on the sword hilt, symbolizing honor. The second symbolizes love." After hearing this, Alicia's cheeks turned red. Fred looked completely confused. He looked around at everyone. The atmosphere seemed wrong. He quickly mumbled something and prepared to retreat. Back in the carriage, Joseph explained the reason and congratulated Fred on becoming a quasi-knight. Fred was obviously shocked. The knighthood he had struggled so hard to achieve was now accomplished just by accepting a handkerchief. Joseph continued explaining, "It's just enjoying a knight's treatment, and only limited to that place in Derma." Fred seemed to understand. No wonder it was called quasi-knight. Just then, Fred alertly sensed something approaching. Sure enough, a group of people in black cloaks were attacking the convoy. Fred was about to draw his sword. Joseph beside him pressed down on him, said, "This is what I prepared before the duel began." The black-clothed men came before the convoy and all knelt on one knee to show respect. The leader held a bag of blood and said, "Lord Joseph, the mission is complete." Joseph looked at the blood bag. His face turned cold, then told the man to stand up. After standing up, the man glanced at Fred with his peripheral vision. Fred felt his hair stand on end as he was stared at, as if a python was eyeing its prey. After standing up, the man didn't linger much longer, showed respect to Joseph once again, then prepared to leave. Joseph noticed Fred's emotions at this moment. Joseph spoke indifferently. "That blood-stained black bag contains the noble's world, a world of ruthlessness, cruelty, and merciless people." The scene shifted, and at this moment all the servants in the dining hall were discussing Fred's awakening of the aura. Everyone was incredulous, especially Sovaning and his followers. At this time, the door opened. Fred slowly walked into the dining hall. The crowd that had just been chattering suddenly fell silent, because they knew that Fred was no longer the same person as before. Fred felt quite helpless at this moment. Now he couldn't even eat properly, because many people were secretly watching him, this big star. Portly also expressed there was nothing he could do about it, estimating the situation would continue for another 2 days. Then Portly suddenly mentioned the servants' vacation, and suggested whether whether Fred wanted to go home with him. Fred thought about it. He seemed to have nowhere else to go. Seeing Fred still hesitating, Portly hurriedly offered unlimited roasted meat, and Fred was slightly tempted. Portly continued, "There are also horses. Haven't you been looking for horses recently? I heard another horse just arrived, and apparently there are several that are even better than the Jaeger Knight's horses." Upon hearing this, Fred's eyes lit up, and he immediately expressed that he would definitely go. Sometime later, in the training ground, Fred was sparring with Jaeger. At this time, Fred wanted to try the aura he had released before. Jaeger saw through his intentions and told Fred to focus. Fred didn't listen to the advice. Seeing this situation, Jaeger instantly became angry and directly struck Fred's back with his sword. Fred cried out in pain and knelt on the ground. Jaeger looked at Fred seriously and said, "Do you think you're impressive just because you fought against a knight? You won't even listen to what I say now?" Fred was about to explain something, but was scared off by Jaeger's glare. Fred hurriedly stood up and apologized. Jaeger didn't want to say much more, turned and said, "That's enough for today." Fred could only helplessly turn and leave. At this moment, Jaeger was very worried about Fred's state of mind, because this seemed somewhat dangerous. That night, Fred didn't choose to rest, but worked even harder to hone his swordsmanship. On the distant wall, Jaeger followed because he was still worried. He breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Fortunately, Fred didn't give up because of this." The next day, Fred looked at the two men with disbelief. It turned out that Joseph had suggested giving Fred a vacation. Fred still wanted to say something, but was directly interrupted by Joseph, so Fred said no more. His eyes kept secretly glancing at Jaeger beside him. Jaeger ignored him, so they fell into brief silence. At this time, Jaeger spoke, "Even during vacation, you can't put down your sword for a moment. I hope when you return next time, you'll be in a different state." Hearing this, Fred knew Jaeger had forgiven him and showed a happy expression. After a few brief words, they let Fred leave. Fred had just walked out the door when he unexpectedly encountered Oksana's maid on the way, so he was brought here and put on a brand new black cloak. Seeing this, Oksana immediately praised Fred as a walking clothes hanger. Fred looked at Oksana's gentle and virtuous expression and couldn't hold himself together anymore, blush spreading across his entire face. At this time, Oksana said, "After this vacation ends, I'll find you a tutor. After all, mistakes like catching a lady's reputation with your hands should only happen once." Fred felt somewhat guilty after hearing this and readily agreed. After their conversation, Fred bowed again to express his gratitude and then turned to leave. On the other side, in the church, a group of nuns were discussing Fred's recent deeds while Mina knelt cleaning the floor. Hearing about the blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, Mina was stunned for a moment, how she hoped it was Fred. But thinking about it, Fred couldn't possibly have become so powerful so quickly. While she was lost in thought, three nuns discovered Mina slacking off and loudly scolded her. It turned out that after they escaped that night, Marcella brought them to the church for refuge. Initially, the bishop disagreed, but Marcella had donated a lot of money to the church. Out of sentiment, the bishop could only agree to let the children in, but Marcella wasn't allowed to enter. Just then, the one-armed Jack's subordinate caught up. He grabbed Marcella in one swift motion and then dragged her away. This was the beginning of the nightmare. The next day, Fred and Portly arrived at the Canner estate. The butler and servants hurried out to greet them. Upon seeing the butler, Portly rushed forward and hugged him. It seemed the two had a very good relationship. Fortunately, the butler reacted in time and quickly apologized to Fred, who said it was fine. Then they prepared to go to the pasture first to see what good horses were available. But as soon as the horses saw Fred, they all fled as if they had seen some monster. Even the cattle and sheep fled together. Fred was greatly disappointed. He had thought only horses couldn't be ridden, but it turned out even cattle couldn't be ridden. Seeing this situation, Portly quickly told Fred there were other horses, and there would always be compatible ones. Fred could only hold on to his last bit of hope. Later, as evening came, the estate was working at full capacity roasting various meats. Fred was also shocked speechless. At this time, a middle-aged man came forward to greet them. "Welcome, welcome. I'm the head of the household, Olsen." Hearing he was the household head, Fred politely greeted him. Seeing this rising star, Olsen was also generous, telling Fred to eat as much as he wanted. After saying this, he led Fred and the others to the living room. As soon as he pushed open the door, Fred was stunned. He never expected Rutger to appear here. Both immediately bowed in greeting. After seeing it was Fred, Rutger said sarcastically, "I wonder if you're still willing to dine with me today." Fred was speechless. He hadn't expected Rutger to be so vindictive. Fred wanted to refuse, but seeing the gazes of the surrounding knights, he could only reluctantly agree, as it was better not to offend a group of knights. The next day, Rutger's group walked along the road. At this moment, Fred was sulking, because his vacation time had been commandeered by Rutger to serve as labor. Dorothea beside him looked displeased. She said, "What are you looking at? Haven't you seen a beastman before? Can you really use a aura? Why can't you ride horses?" Faced with several questions in a row, Fred only replied with 10 words, "In life, anything is possible." Unexpectedly, Dorothea continued asking questions, and Fred became somewhat annoyed. Fortunately, Rutger interrupted in time, and Dorothea had to give up. At this time, a knight pointed to a group of people walking in the distance. They were pilgrims. Then he had his subordinates raise the banner to show their intentions. Fred also understood the purpose of this trip. Hunting was just a pretense. The real purpose was to protect those pilgrims. Suddenly, smoke exploded in the distance, as if something was approaching. Looking carefully, it was a herd of wild horses, but for some reason they were running south. Immediately after, Fred's heart suddenly jumped, as if something bad was about to happen. Rutger also sensed something, and his expression became serious. Just then, the ground began to shake violently. Fred was the first to react. This wasn't an earthquake. It was the tremor from a deathworm's movement. Then they saw the deathworm bite a fleeing horse in one gulp. Dorothea was surprised for a moment because deathworms don't eat meat, but this deathworm was strange, as if it was being controlled by someone. After eating the wild horse, the deathworm turned its gaze toward the distant pilgrims. Seeing the situation, Rutger immediately asked Dorothea what deathworms react to. Dorothea said blankly, only to vibrations. Seeing Dorothea was somewhat panicked, Rutger shouted loudly, telling Dorothea to wake up. Then he ordered Fred to protect Dorothea well, as he was going to attract the deathworm's attention. Fred received the order and immediately responded, understood. Then Rutger led everyone to charge quickly toward the deathworm. Facing this level of monster, Rutger directly deployed his aura and launched a fierce attack on the deathworm. But the deathworm had the title of Dragon's Remnant. How could it be defeated so easily? When the smoke cleared, the deathworm hadn't suffered any damage at all. Then the deathworm bit toward Rutger's direction. Fortunately, Rutger reacted in time and hurriedly dodged the attack. But the deathworm seized the opportunity and burrowed underground, then quickly drilled toward the pilgrims. Seeing the situation, Fred turned and told Dorothea to speed up. But unexpectedly, Dorothea was drawing something with her tail. Dorothea hurriedly explained, this is a ritual of our beastman tribe. Then the talisman began to emit light. Fred didn't waste words and directly snatched the talisman, then turned and jumped off the cliff. The first half went smoothly, but his coolness lasted less than 3 seconds, as Fred's foot slipped, and he rolled straight down, then crashed heavily to the ground. The two people on the mountaintop looked at Fred lying on the ground in shock, but Fred was completely unharmed, and even he couldn't quite believe it. While surprised, Fred's body began to emit dazzling light. The lead black horse beside him seemed to sense something. It turned to look in Fred's direction. An extremely gentle aura attracted its attention. It was the blessing of the spirits. But now wasn't the time to think about these things. The urgent matter was to deal with the deathworm. At this time, Fred's gaze swept over, and he actually saw Priest Andre. His heart immediately panicked, turning to look at Rutger's position. The distance was too far. The deathworm would definitely arrive first. At this moment, Fred looked at the talisman in his hand. After hesitating for a moment, he still decided to use the talisman himself to attract the deathworm's attention. Then the magic circle was activated, and Fred's sword was also imbued with vibration magic. Then Fred thrust forcefully, and the ground began to shake. But this vibration wasn't enough. He had to release his aura. Fred suddenly opened his eyes wide, and at the same time the surroundings emitted incredibly dazzling light. The deathworm was immediately attracted and rushed quickly toward Fred. The deathworm launched the first attack. Fortunately, Fred retreated and dodged the attack. The sword soul within him told him not to be too eager to fight, as this guy wasn't something ordinary people could handle yet. Fred naturally knew this too, but the deathworm's attacks were too fierce, and Fred was somewhat overwhelmed. Just as Fred was thinking about how to deal with it, the deathworm directly burrowed underground. It completely disappeared from Fred's sight. When he realized what was happening, it was already too late. The deathworm burst directly from beneath his feet. Rutger was shocked. He stared blankly at the scene before him, but the next second, a figure burst from the smoke. It was the black horse that had saved him. The sword soul told him to look again with his aura. Unexpectedly, a silver horn had appeared on the horse's forehead. At this time, Rutger caught up and asked if Fred was injured. Fred said he was fine. Hearing that Fred was okay, Rutger then explained the tactics. You go lure the deathworm over, leave the rest to me. Looking at Rutger's determined eyes, Fred reluctantly accepted, and then charged forward quickly. Seeing the deathworm was chasing him, Fred felt relieved, and had the black horse accelerate to dodge attacks, while he continued to attract the deathworm's attention with his aura's amplification. Arriving at the designated position, Rutger told the others to scatter. He himself closed his eyes and gathered power in his sword. Fred was stunned seeing this, and the sword soul explained, he temporarily expanded his own world. Only knights who can deeply examine themselves can use this. Rutger truly was an extraordinary knight beyond imagination. The deathworm seemed to sense something, and immediately stopped its moving body. Fred was obviously panicked for a moment. Indeed, his own world was still too weak. Suddenly, the black horse's forehead emitted dazzling light, and then Fred felt his abilities improving. The aura he emitted once again attracted the deathworm's attention, but at this moment, Fred had reached his limit. Fortunately, Rutger's knights charged up together and activated their auras, which continued to attract the deathworm's attention. At this time, Rutger was ready to strike, just as Fred and the others passed by him. Rutger's eyes focused, and a terrifying aura emanated from his entire body. Then he struck with all his might. The deathworm instantly turned to ash. Fred stepped forward to inquire about Rutger's injuries. Rutger said he was fine, then struggled to stand up, but his legs were somewhat weak, and he fell on his bottom. At this time, Rutger wanted Fred to help him up, but Fred also sat down on his bottom. Rutger looked awkwardly at his hands suspended in midair, and then sighed helplessly. At this time, the knights nearby also came over to praise Fred for doing well. Fred said thank you embarrassedly. Then Priest Andre's voice came from nearby. Fred immediately stood up and bowed. Andre also gave Fred the highest blessing. Seeing the scene, the pilgrims behind also knelt down and prayed together. Time came to evening, and several people rested and recovered on the spot. At this moment, Fred was frowning as he wiped his sword. Rutger walked over slowly with a bottle of wine, then sat down and asked Fred if he wanted a sip. Fred was about to refuse, but Rutger directly interrupted. Now that I think about it, you've refused me 3 times already. Did Joseph tell you to stay stay away from me? After hearing this, Fred reluctantly took the wine bottle and drank it all in one gulp. Rutger saw Fred's battle-scarred sword, and then asked why he didn't have someone repair it. Fred was also helpless. Other blacksmiths couldn't fix it. Only by finding its owner could it be done. Rutger didn't think much about it. After taking a sip of wine, he asked Fred where he planned to look for the sword's owner. Fred's eyes focused, then he said, Digia. At this time, on the other side, in Oksana's mansion, Oksana was embroidering the Heinar family crest. The maid praised how well Lady Oksana was doing. Oksana said this was her first time doing it. She had seen her mother do it before, but these traditions had been gradually forgotten. After all, those knights living in luxury had no right to take up their banners. The next day, several people began their journey home. The Black Horse nearby also ran to bid farewell to the convoy. Although Fred was somewhat reluctant, the Black Horse had to protect its own tribe, and he had things to do. Andre saw Fred's reluctance and comforted him. You don't need to be too reluctant. Life is composed of joys and sorrows. When fate arrives, you will naturally reunite. After hearing this, Fred also relaxed a little. At this time, in the Earl's mansion, the Earl was frowning and pondering something. It turned out that just now, news came from the west that Earl Rafnoma had fallen, but there was no news from the royal side. These new rulers seemed to be attempting to break the old feudal society. On the other side, Fred was hesitating whether to knock and report. After all, he had helped Rutger. Given Jaeger's personality, he would definitely get a beating. But this was just his imagination, so he knocked on the door. They chatted briefly. The situation didn't seem that bad, but looking up, he found two people staring at him intently. Although they were angry, he was their servant after all. Then Joseph stood up and came to a banner saying, This is a banner symbolizing one's own honor. You now have the right to take up the banner that belongs only to you. Go, take this back to your homeland. Heinar and Bayod will support you. Go personally deal with the filthy existence that binds you. At this moment, Fred could no longer express his emotions in words. Was it joy, relief, or emotion? He only knew that he finally had the right to judge those bastards. As soon as Fred received his banner, he could no longer contain himself and set off for Digia that very night. In the evening, in the Digia dance hall, a group of men surrounded a room, and inside the room, a woman was dressing and applying makeup. This person was Marcella. It turned out that after being caught that day, she was sold to the dance hall for the men outside to play with. An old woman nearby was urging Marcella to hurry up and go out. Marcella said nothing, just continued applying light makeup. Seeing this situation, the old woman directly lifted Marcella's chin and said, There's still a long time ahead. Until you're old and ugly, you won't be able to leave here. Marcella just smiled faintly, then glared fiercely at the old woman. The old woman was also startled, thinking, I didn't expect her to still be defiant after being treated like this. Then Marcella put down her makeup tools and stood up to leave the room. At this moment, Marcella had already decided to end it all tonight. After all, Sanji was dead, and seeing that the others were all living well, she could die without regrets. The men outside all cheered loudly when they saw Marcella come out. The old woman said, Those who want to spend the night with Digia's Black Rose, please bid your prices. Everyone immediately began competing. The old woman had to admire Marcella. Despite being middle-aged, she still had such charm. At this time, someone in the crowd shouted, 4 gold coins. The old woman felt this price was about right, and was about to announce the result. Just then, a voice suddenly came from outside the door. 100 gold coins. Everyone was startled. The old woman was also stunned. Then a figure entered the dance hall. Hearing this voice, Marcella became somewhat panicked, because this voice sounded too much like that man's voice, the man who had caused their organization's destruction. Then Fred said as he walked, Also, bring me a serving of roasted sausage and black pudding, plus potato cakes and white bread. After hearing this, Marcella was surprised, because these were things Sanji liked to eat. Then a golden light flashed before her eyes. That's right, Fred had returned. Looking at the man who had grown up before her, Marcella was already in tears. But reality rang alarm bells for her, so she hurriedly told Fred to run away, because Jack's subordinates were watching here. The old woman saw the two whispering and guessed what was happening. Then she asked Jack's subordinates deal with him. Several people understood and stood up to take action. Fred was completely unperturbed. He said, Before paying, I happen to have a debt to settle with you all. Seeing the old woman was confused, Fred directly emanated a cold aura and said, Jack owes me a debt. The leading man was about to draw his sword when Fred instantly appeared and slit his throat. Almost no one could react to what had happened, because it was too fast. The others saw the situation and drew their swords, demanding to know who Fred was. Fred raised his short sword and said, I am Sanji's last short sword. Hearing this, one subordinate finally realized and said, He's Fred. Fred replied, I am Fred. Come on, kill me just like that day. Everyone shuddered, because the aura of Fred before them was too much like a bloodthirsty wolf. Seeing the men weren't moving, Fred struck first. With one stab, the man couldn't react in time. Then he went on a killing spree among the crowd, one scream after another. They fell one by one, until their blood paid for every tear Marcella had shed. On the other side, in Jack's organization, Jack was lying exhausted in his chair. He reflected on his life's experiences. Now that Sanji was dead, he had become the leader of the entire back alley. If he wanted to climb higher, he had to plunder others' things, stepping on enemies' corpses to climb higher. But now that he had climbed to the peak, he realized such fate was merely decided by the upper class's single word, this damned life. Just then, a subordinate burst through the door and exclaimed, Boss, we're surrounded by the guard. Hearing this, Jack could only smile helplessly. This day had finally come. On the other side, Bolden had the mayor and guards surround the entire back alley. Looking at the mayor's fawning appearance, he guessed that the mayor's turning a blind eye to the back alley's affairs was all due to receiving high tribute payments. Bolden could only sigh. This mayor probably wouldn't last much longer either. At this time, the mayor asked when the knight from the guild killed would come. Bolden turned to look behind and said, "He's already here." Then they saw Fred walking out from afar, covered in blood. Seeing Fred wanted to go alone, Bolden couldn't help but worry, as he would be in trouble if Fred got hurt. But looking at Fred's determined eyes, Bolden could only sigh helplessly. Then he handed the banner to Fred. Fred planted the banner into the ground, and the two family crests were revealed. Everyone was stunned. They hadn't seen banners for a very long time. Then Bolden began to pronounce Jack's crimes. After the pronouncement, he let Fred do as he pleased. Fred didn't hesitate at all. He drew his long sword and began releasing the power of his aura. Recalling his unwilling past, Fred's eyes became increasingly resolute. Then he struck down with his sword. The door shattered with a crash. The people behind the door were directly blown away. Fred also walked in immediately. It was time to cut these evil ties. Fred said slowly, "I am Fred of Degia. I am not only a rightful agent, but also a rightful avenger." Hearing this familiar voice, Jack slowly stood up and couldn't stop laughing. Seeing only Fred charge in alone, everyone raised their swords to strike. But Fred was a knight. He instantly dealt with these small fry before him. The others were all scared, but since Fred was just one person, they naively thought they could surround him. But Fred immediately activated his aura. In just an instant, everyone had white marks on their bodies. Then, within the circular range centered on Fred, everyone suffered varying degrees of casualties. Seeing such power, everyone decided to tear down the stairs so Fred couldn't come up. Fred was also slightly troubled, but this was the Black Rose Tavern where he had lived since childhood. How could he not be familiar with it? Then he cut the rope with one sword stroke, used the rope's momentum to fly up and reach the top floor. Then came endless slaughter. Faced with this demon-like man, they were afraid, completely afraid. Seeing no one dared to step forward, Fred took the initiative to attack. Wherever he went, none survived. Even the sword soul within praised him as a natural-born killer. After killing the last person, Fred looked back. Although he hadn't recreated that day's scene, it was enough. It was time to finish this. So he leisurely walked up the stairs and then opened the door. Jack had been waiting for a long time. Jack didn't speak, but placed a cup of wine beside him, then sighed helplessly and said, "Although I'd heard the rumors, I still didn't dare believe it." After saying this, he stood up, drew his sword and prepared, saying, "Let me put a perfect end to your world." Seeing this situation, Fred also drew his sword to meet the enemy. A great battle was about to break out, but Jack, having fought his way to this position, definitely had strength. He actually blocked Fred's attack and pushed Fred back. Compared to strength, Fred was better at agility and technique. After just a few rounds, Fred successfully suppressed Jack. But Jack wasn't one to give up easily. He gritted his teeth and pushed hard, again pushing Fred back. Then came continuous strikes. Fred was also stunned. At this time, Jack also fell into memories. He once had dreams too, dreams of claiming that light as his own. He wanted to grasp that brilliance, so he worked hard to climb upward, even though there was a mountain of corpses and sea of fire beneath his feet. But he finally climbed to the peak of the back alley. But why still couldn't he touch that light, even if it was built with blood? Thinking of this, a twinkling star appeared before his eyes. That was Fred holding the sword. Seeing the glowing Fred, Jack finally understood. To touch the light, one must have the qualification to shine. Looking at Fred glowing before him, Jack laughed loudly. "Excellent! Sanji would be very happy to see this." Hearing Sanji's name, Fred could no longer hold back. He shouted and struck with his sword. Jack had also come to terms with it. He said, "Today is a good day. I'm going to open all the wine barrels in the back alley and hold a feast. You'll climb even higher in the future." With that, their attacks repelled each other again. But the next second, Fred instantly adjusted his posture and thrust with his sword. Jack was pierced, and his life began flashing before his eyes. This was fine too. Rather than being crushed by a powerful world, it was better to be a stepping stone for a capable young man. Looking at Jack, who was about to die, Fred asked if he had any last words. Jack placed his iron hand on Fred's head, and then said, "You've worked hard. Rest a while before you go." Fred was puzzled why Jack showed such an expression. Then he pulled out his long sword. Jack swayed and covered his wound. Although he had done countless evil deeds in his life, at least he had lived brilliantly. Then Jack raised his iron hand and shouted, "I've had a very fulfilling life, Sanji. I'm coming." With that, he fell backward and dropped from the high building with a smile. Fred, having completed his revenge, felt no joy at all, but rather a faint bitterness. So he turned to look at the cup of wine still on the table, then picked up the wine and drank it all. After drinking, he left a gold coin and turned to leave, walking through this building full of corpses. Seeing this situation, ripples were stirred in the young man's world. After resolving everything, Fred slowly walked out of the building. His heart was mixed with emotions, and his eyes showed no light at all. Boldan and the guards behind him were all frightened by this terrifying presence. He felt that Fred before him wasn't a person, but an unreachable mountain peak. But Fred didn't care about their opinions. Just as he turned to leave, a voice came from afar. "Fred, I'm Haven." Hearing this familiar voice again, Fred suddenly came to his senses. He looked at the person before him with disbelief. He had thought all the family members of Sanji's organization had been wiped out, never expecting Haven to still be alive. At this moment, hope seemed to return to the young man's eyes. He was about to say something, but his body had reached its limit, and he fainted in Haven's arms. The next day, Fred looked down at the vast back alley, feeling somewhat uncomfortable, as he had originally been just one of them. But it didn't matter now. The urgent matter was to find Boldan to discuss what came next. A few minutes later, he saw the haggard-looking Boldan, but this wasn't his fault, as there were simply too many documents to process. So Boldan was ready to assign Fred some tasks. Fred was stunned for a moment, then said, "I can't read documents requirements and such. Boldan knew this, of course, so the task he gave Fred was captain of the guard, that is, arrest authority. Lord Joseph wanted to take this opportunity to reorganize the back alley. Fred readily agreed, as it was Lord Joseph's order, but before that Fred had one more thing to do: go to the prison to find someone, even if he had to turn the entire back alley upside down to find him. That morning, Fred hurried to the prison. After greeting the guards, he walked straight in and stopped at an iron cage. Everyone was scared away by this terrifying presence. Fred ignored them and silently searched for something. Soon he saw a person hiding in the corner. This was Otto, who had deliberately let him escape years ago. Fred had come to rescue him. At midday, at the church, Fred slowly got down from the carriage. His purpose here was singular: to take away his family member Mina. But at this moment, Mina was being bullied by the nuns, who demanded that if she didn't finish washing the dishes, she couldn't participate in prayer. So Fred looked for a long time without finding her. But to avoid affecting progress, Fred still began praying first. Just then, familiar footsteps came from afar. Fred smiled slightly and stood up to look back. But the next second, Fred immediately frowned. How had she become so thin? This scene happened to be seen by a nun, who hurriedly asked what was happening. Fred chose to ignore her and walked directly toward Mina. Mina looked at the familiar yet strange man before her, feeling emotional, even thinking this wasn't Fred. Only when Fred called her name did she realize. Fred looked at Mina's dirty clothes and calloused fingers, his heart filled with anger, saying, "Damn it, acting like a fool, what are you doing?" With that, he crouched down to help her clean her clothes. Mina was incredulous, her body slightly trembling. After confirming it was Fred, she couldn't hold back anymore. Tears just fell straight down. All the grievances of these years were released today. Seeing the situation, Fred immediately hugged Mina tightly. He had originally wanted to thank the church for their care over the years, but seeing Mina like this, Fred didn't plan to give them a good face. Thus, the three people who were homeless that night finally had a new home. Then they took the carriage home. That night, the blacksmith was recalling his life's experiences. He used only 4 words to describe his current situation, accomplished nothing. Seeing it was getting late, the blacksmith prepared to close and rest. Just as he was about to close, a voice came from behind. "Boss, closing so early? My sword is waiting to be repaired." Hearing this, the blacksmith was stunned, then turned around. Sure enough, it was that little brat from years ago, now returned in glory. The blacksmith excitedly said, "Of course I can fix it." Then the blacksmith took the weathered honor sword and asked about the origin of the scars on the sword. Fred described them one by one. There were goblins and deathworms too. The blacksmith was filled with relief after hearing this and decided to use the rest of his life to perfect this honor sword with all his might. The next day, Fred found Haven, wanting him to help with something. That was to search for clues about Jack's hidden assets. Haven pondered for a moment, then slowly said, "Perhaps it's related to the courtesans who were sold." Upon hearing this, Fred immediately said, "That's a bit tricky. I searched around briefly, but several people disappeared without a trace. I know one of them was called Anna." Haven said puzzledly, "That's very strange. Logically speaking, a living person couldn't disappear so completely." While Haven was thinking, Otter interrupted the two who were discussing from a distance. He said, "Fred, as you said, I went around and finally found a suspicious place." Hearing there was news, Fred immediately got up, ready to go to the scene to investigate. After some time, Fred arrived at that suspicious place. It was a butcher shop. As soon as he arrived, Fred handed a piece of paper to the boss with the missing person's name written on it. The boss said, "I don't know him. If you want to ask, go ask Black Bear." Fred smiled faintly and said, "Of course I'll go ask. But how do you know what's written on the paper is a person's name? People in the back alley basically can't read. It seems you're an outsider who doesn't understand the situation here. What you're selling isn't pork, but human flesh, right?" After hearing this, the boss froze in place for 3 seconds. Then he immediately swung his knife at Fred. Seeing this, Fred wasn't panicked at all and directly pulled out his dagger. A few minutes later, the boss was beaten down, and he confessed everything he knew. Seeing he had confessed everything, Fred didn't make things difficult for him anymore. Later, he organized the information with Otter. First was the butcher Black Bear, who was now a major figure in the back alley. Second was the slave trader. Just then, Otter's brother came running hurriedly, saying he had found clues. He said someone saw Anna getting into a carriage, and what was particularly strange was that all those getting into the carriage were pregnant women. This immediately made Fred fall into deep thought. Why would someone specifically buy pregnant women? What did they want to do? Suddenly, a familiar and terrifying figure appeared in Fred's mind. Could someone be using black magic to create female ghosts? This made Fred panic. He hurriedly got up to find Boldan and told him about this matter. Boldan was speechless. He had finally found some time to rest, and now another matter came up. Boldan was about to refuse, but Joseph's carriage had already arrived downstairs. He immediately complained. Again, wasn't it supposed to arrive in 2 days? But complaining aside, he still had to greet his master. Upon meeting, Joseph immediately sensed that Fred had something on his mind, so he let several people go inside for a detailed discussion. The mayor then warmly welcomed them inside, but Jaeger didn't give him any pleasant looks, because he knew his mayoral position wouldn't last long. Sure enough, once inside, Joseph told the mayor he didn't need to come tomorrow. Everyone present was shocked to hear this, but the mayor couldn't disobey his master's words and could only leave dejectedly. Joseph didn't care and directly told Fred to tell him, the new mayor, whatever was on his mind. So Fred told him about everything that had happened recently, as well as their plan to find Black Bear. After listening, Joseph told Fred to go and come back quickly, because there was another matter for him to handle. This matter was very important, concerning the Black Mage. So Fred hurriedly had Otter bring the banner and come with him to the deepest part of the back alley. The alleys here were the most chaotic, and there were all sorts of vicious people. Fred's purpose in coming here was to find the butcher Black Bear, but the people inside made Fred wait a while. Fred didn't mind, since he had time time anyway, so he decided to wait. But he waited until evening before the people inside opened the door to let Fred in. But Fred chose to ignore them. After all, knights had their pride. Seeing Fred wouldn't come in, the man prepared to close the door. Hearing about closing the door, Fred's expression darkened and he threatened, "If you dare close that door, there will be several more corpses today." Upon hearing this, the man froze for a moment. He was about to say something, but Fred directly unfurled the banner and said in a deep voice, "I will exercise my rights under the guarantee of my honor. Tell Black Bear to come out and greet me personally." Upon hearing this, the man completely panicked, because he had heard that if the banner was planted in the ground, terrible things would happen. After receiving Fred's threat, Black Bear lost his previous arrogance and said he would fully cooperate with Lord Joseph. So Fred hurriedly returned to the mayor's office to tell Joseph this news. Joseph smiled faintly, very satisfied with Fred's behavior. Since it was already settled, Joseph arranged his task. That was to establish a search team to fully search for the Black Mage. For this, he planned to give the task to Gregory. After listening, Gregory solemnly said he would definitely complete the mission and live up to expectations. Then he began selecting teammates. He chose Sir Cade, who was skilled in tracking, and the rising star Fred. A few days later, following Sir Cade's tracking, they arrived at Baron Utman's territory. Only the weather here seemed somewhat strange, with torrential rain for several consecutive days. They discussed and decided to set off again the next day. The next day, the rain indeed stopped, but thick fog rose up. Everything revealed an eerie atmosphere. Fred didn't mind, thinking this was a normal phenomenon. Then they discussed and decided to find an inn to stay at. The boss was very puzzled. It was still so early, yet someone wanted to check in at this time. Gregory explained the situation. During the explanation, a cute little girl poked her head out and stared intently at Fred. Fred waved at her in a friendly manner. Seeing this, the little girl immediately blushed. Suddenly, the Sword Soul's voice rang in Fred's mind. "Fred, there's something strange here. I'll lend you my world. Take a look at that little girl." Fred looked closely. He saw a black aura emanating from the necklace on the girl's chest. The black aura transformed into a ghostly hand wrapped around the girl's neck. This was a curse. Then Fred followed the aura to its end. The end of the black aura was actually a church. Seeing this, Fred didn't hesitate. He walked straight in boldly. After searching around, everything in the church looked quite normal, with nothing unusual. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind. To avoid alerting anyone and arousing suspicion, Fred immediately crouched down, pretending to pray. The person was a priest from the church. Just as Fred was about to bow and pay respects, he noticed something was off. The pattern on the book the priest was holding was the same as the one on the little girl's necklace. This was too strange. This didn't seem like a normal church symbol. Fred forced himself to calm down. Now wasn't the time to panic. The urgent matter was to find Sir Gregory and report. So after praying, Fred left the church without showing any emotion. But after coming out, Fred didn't immediately go find Gregory. Instead, he found a nearby old man doing farm work and asked if anything strange had happened recently. Originally, the old man didn't think there was anything wrong, but hearing Fred say this, the old man said, "Indeed, it feels a bit off. Recently, children have been dying mysteriously, like some infectious disease." After getting the answer, Fred bowed in gratitude and hurriedly left, because he knew this wasn't some simple infectious disease, but a curse. On the road, the Sword Soul spoke. "This black mage should be very strong. Only high-level priests can see through it, but there's no evidence, so taking rash measures would be risky." Just then, a cloaked figure in the distance caught Fred's attention. He was holding the same pattern necklace Fred had seen in the church, giving the necklaces to children, and his behavior was suspicious. After giving the necklaces to the children, he left. So to investigate further, Fred quietly followed. But he always felt like the cloaked person was deliberately luring him out of the village. While Fred was thinking, the cloaked person flashed and appeared right in front of Fred. Fred immediately drew his sword to face the enemy, but the cloaked person's strength was great, and with just one strike, Fred was knocked back. The knockback Fred only felt his arm going numb from the shock. Sensing the opponent's strength, he immediately activated his aura. The moment after the cloaked person attacked, Fred quickly moved his body, then thrust with his sword. But the cloaked person was too strong and dodged the attack with a simple lean backward, and quickly counterattacked. When the sword fell, the collision of their two auras produced a huge explosion. When the smoke cleared, Fred was kneeling on the ground, while the cloaked person only had their cloak damaged, suffering no injury at all. Seeing her aura, Fred was stunned for a moment, because her aura seemed somewhat different. The Sword Soul then explained, "This is sacred power. She's a paladin. Paladins have one weakness. They suppress people first, then communicate." Although Fred also thought about fighting back, but the opponent was too strong, and after just a few rounds, he was pinned to the ground with no power to resist. Outmatched in skill, Fred could only surrender. Then he confessed everything. "I come from Digia. I came here to investigate some matters." Learning he wasn't an enemy, the woman followed Fred back to the inn and introduced herself. "I am Justia, sent by the Northern Grand Diocese." Gregory also returned the courtesy, showing respect. Then everyone began exchanging information. Justia said, "I believe that church is the main body of the curse." Gregory was stunned after hearing this, thinking, a paladin who follows the church actually thinks the church is the culprit. It seems the situation is more serious than imagined. The development has exceeded my authority. Justia saw Gregory's concerns and told Gregory and the others they didn't need to interfere in this matter. Gregory and the others were also troubled, but faced with authority limitations, they had no choice. Only Justia could handle it alone. After some time, the sky gradually darkened. At this moment, Fred was aimlessly looking outside. Due to authority issues, their investigation had to stop, and they would leave soon. Seeing Fred was about to leave, the little girl became sad. She begged Fred to stay a few more days. Fred thought for a while, and finally softened, agreeing. The little girl was very happy. She even gave Fred a flower ring she had woven as a gift. But right after giving the ring, she was urged by the boss to go to bed. After confirming Fred wouldn't leave tomorrow, she turned and went upstairs. But after just 2 steps, she stopped. Then she began trembling all over. Finally, her eyes rolled back and she fell straight to the ground. Fred was shocked and immediately used his aura to check the specific situation. Then he saw the curse had been activated. At the same time, Gregory and the other two heard the commotion and hurried over. Seeing this scene, everyone couldn't help but worry. Miss Justia's expression turned cold. She turned around, ready to go to the church alone. Gregory's face looked grim. He wanted to go too, but rules were rules. This made Fred very angry. Fred said, "Since you won't go, then I'll go myself." But he was stopped by Gregory. Gregory said, "Listen well, Rising Star. A knight's sword is heavy. Our swords need reason and responsibility, so we just need to find a reason." Hearing this, Fred was somewhat confused, not understanding what Gregory meant. Meanwhile, Justia found the source of the dark aura. Sure enough, it was the church. Then she pushed open the door and walked in. The priest smiled eerily. "You came quite quickly, but why are you alone? Without everyone present, we can't pray properly." The priest's words were cryptic, and Justia didn't quite understand. But the next second she knew, because a group of female ghosts suddenly burst out from outside the door, all shouting, "Where is my child?" The scene was terrifying. Justia didn't hesitate and immediately mobilized her sacred power with full force. A beam of light shot up to the sky. This was the sacred skill, Solemn Exorcism. All evil spirits hit would be suppressed. However, this skill had a drawback. It consumed lifespan. The priest, seeing the time was right, decisively summoned a pitch-black treasure sword. As they say, strike while the iron is hot. Seeing the priest about to attack with his sword, Justia knew she couldn't escape, so she decisively burned her remaining lifespan, preparing to unleash her strongest attack. At this critical moment, a burning wooden chair flew from a distance. This was thrown by Fred and the others. The priest smiled faintly. With one sword strike, he shattered the wooden chair into pieces. Although the wooden chair became fragments, it gave Fred a chance to get close. Fred suppressed the priest with one sword strike. However, rather than saying Fred suppressed the priest, it was more accurate to say the priest was stunned seeing the sword's soul within Fred. During this time, Gregory asked what was happening. Justia hurriedly told him the root of everything was the bell tower outside. They had to hurry. Gregory also knew they had to hurry, but Sir Cade couldn't use aura. It seemed they had to let Fred free his hands first. After saying this, Gregory suddenly gathered his strength, and his eyes also burst with aura. He bear hugged the priest away from the battle, and told Fred to quickly go clean up whatever was in the bell tower. Fred immediately set off upon receiving the order, but the priest used black magic. He controlled the female ghost army to surge toward Fred again. Fred had difficulty moving through the ghost horde. Fortunately, Justia enchanted Cade's arrows. This allowed Fred to escape the predicament. Thus, Fred had a clear path all the way. Meanwhile, Sir Gregory had successfully completely suppressed the priest. This priest seemed strong, but in Gregory's hands, he was just a rookie. Even after being defeated, the priest kept taunting with his words, so Gregory cut off his head, making him shut up forever. The female ghosts outside also stopped moving because of this. Just as Gregory was about to take a sip of water to relax, unexpectedly, the priest's severed head actually spoke, and flames also gushed out from the original body's severed parts. Justia thought this was bad, because she recognized this monster as the headless knight, Dullahan. On the other side, Fred finally reached the bell tower's location, but the dense runes above gave Fred a headache. Fortunately, he had the sword soul's guidance. Just as he was about to attack, the ground suddenly cracked, and Fred's spellcasting was interrupted. Then Fred fell straight down. After landing, Fred saw the church before him had become ruins. He was somewhat bewildered. Before he could think much, the headless knight walked out from behind. Fred was startled and immediately raised his sword, asking where the others were. The headless knight smiled faintly. He said, "Their aura is useless to me, so I let them sleep for a while. What I want is only this," and with that, he lifted up what was from the bell tower. Fred, seeing the source of the curse before him, raised his sword to strike. But this mindless attack was useless against the headless knight. In just an instant, offense and defense switched. Only the effects were different. The headless knight could easily block attacks, but Fred couldn't defend against the headless knight's attacks. Fortunately, Fred had the elf's blessing. Otherwise, he couldn't have blocked at all. Fred also seized this opportunity to strike with his sword, although he successfully split the headless knight in two. But the headless knight was an undead creature. A mere slash had no effect at all. Soon, Fred was suppressed again. The sword soul finally couldn't stand it anymore. The sword soul said, "Young man, I allow you to connect to my world." As soon as the words fell, Fred's aura suddenly turned gray. The headless knight was shocked by this scene, but before he could react, Fred flashed to his front, and gray aura swirled around them. But as the saying goes, the bigger the special effects, the lower the damage, so the recent attack only scratched the headless knight's hand. After his hand was scratched, the headless knight finally got angry. Then he activated his complete form. Seeing this, Fred was stunned. What was this thing? In the 1 second he was stunned, the headless knight disappeared. When Fred came to his senses, the headless knight was already behind behind him. The headless knight struck with his sword. Fred was heavily knocked away, then fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Next, the headless knight prepared to immediately deliver the finishing blow. Just as he was about to stab the sword into Fred's body, Fred suddenly grabbed the long sword with his hand. His hand was also emanating silver light. It turned out the sword soul had taken control of the unconscious Fred, helping him block this strike. Then, huge light exploded from Fred's body. Unlike before, this time the headless knight was beaten and howling. Although the sword soul had lost his memory, he was also a knight, one who existed to protect. Then it was time for the second round. The headless knight couldn't help but be frightened by this terrifying aura, especially Fred's lightning-fast attacks. The headless knight was beaten with no power to fight back. The headless knight, pinned to the ground, wanted to say something, but was directly crushed by the sword soul. However, the headless knight was an undead creature after all, and soon restored his body. But so what if he restored his body? Since he could be killed once, he could be killed a second time. So what followed was the sword soul's one-sided crushing of the headless knight. Although the headless knight couldn't feel pain, every attack from this man before him was extremely fierce. Each attack caused damage to his soul. Finally, even his heart was torn open. Only then did they discover this cunning fellow had actually hidden the curse's source in his heart. Seeing this, the sword soul crushed it with one palm. Thus, the trapped souls successfully returned to their bodies. But how to kill this guy? For this, the sword soul had a good idea. That was to chop all his limbs to pieces. The headless knight still wanted to escape, but was cut down by another sword that severed both his legs. Just as the sword soul was about to cut off his last arm, the headless knight finally couldn't take it anymore and began shouting loudly, "Save me, Lord Lamasut!" As soon as the words fell, pitch-black tentacles appeared out of nowhere. But the tentacles weren't there to save him, but to kill him and silence him. Hearing this name, the sword soul only felt it was somewhat familiar, but now wasn't the time to think about this, because Fred's body couldn't hold on anymore. With that, Fred fell straight down. At the same time, in Utman's territory, a woman sat calmly on a throne. Below the throne were bloody severed heads, and countless headless knights. That's right, this woman was Lamasut, mentioned by the headless knight. 3 days later, Fred painfully crawled up from bed. He had been unconscious for 3 whole days. Although his body was in pain, at least no one was injured. The sword soul said it should be because Justia finally released a barrier, which prevented everyone from getting hurt. She was indeed very capable. After saying this, Fred was stunned for a moment. The sword soul was actually praising someone, but the next second, he seemed to think of something else. That was to thank sword soul on behalf of everyone for his help. The sword soul didn't speak, and the air fell into brief awkwardness. Just then, the sword soul's voice slowly came, "You worked hard too." Fred smiled faintly. These words really touched his heart. The next day, Fred came to the village to find Justia to discuss something. The paladin told him to wait a moment. After some time, the paladin came out to notify Fred he could go in. But as soon as Fred walked into the church, he was stunned, because the entire church was full of corpses. These corpses were all the controlled female ghosts. Among them was Anna, who had once taken care of him, only now she had become a corpse. Fred said regretfully, "May you live a happier life in your next life." After some time, at the paladin station camp, Justia wanted to ask what exactly happened that day, so she found Fred to talk. Fred was afraid of exposing the sword soul's matter, so his words were half true and half false. He said, "Oh right, there seemed to be another name, something like Lama." Hearing these words, Justia was stunned and said, "Lama Sut." Fred said, "Right, that's the name." After getting a definitive answer, Justia turned and left the tent, and her expression became extremely terrifying. Meanwhile, in Degia's mayor's office, Joseph was having a detailed discussion with an elderly man. The old man was called Ramon, a knight of the former head of house, and also the teacher of Jaeger and other older generation knights. He possessed countless honors, and Joseph had to treat him with courtesy, but Ramon didn't put on airs at all, instead calling himself the lowest person. He came this time only to see Fred, who had been in the spotlight recently. He said, "Before this, I met the head of house, because I still have the last ducat in my hand. I wanted to get some understanding, but Sturma's attendants are all blockheads." "So are the attendants you've trained the same." Hearing this, Joseph was shocked. Others might not know what a ducat was, but he definitely knew. A ducat was a symbol of honor. Seeing Joseph stunned, Jaeger explained, "Fred is at least stronger than those guys, he's just a bit stubborn." Ramon said, "Hearing you say that, it sounds pretty good. As long as he's not like that Sovaning, who relies on having backing and acts arrogantly." Before he finished speaking, Joseph said, "Fred has no parents, so he wouldn't be like that. He grew up in the back alley, with no one to rely on. He reached his current position entirely through his own personal ability." As for why Joseph said this, he had a selfish motive. He wanted to evoke empathy from this legendary figure. Joseph said, "Lord Ramon, so I don't want you to give him the ducat, but I hope you can teach him a move." Ramon slowly opened his eyes and said, "Since it's the young master's request, then I'll take a good look." The next day, at the mayor's office, Joseph first praised the three for completing their mission well, but the next second his tone changed sharply. "But drawing the sword of Bayod on another lord's land is unforgivable." Gregory immediately expressed his willingness to accept punishment. Ramon behind couldn't help but laugh. Fred glanced back but didn't pay much attention. Joseph continued, "Although I understand your intentions were good, this time you've really caused big trouble and might trigger a war." As soon as he finished speaking, Ramon interrupted, "You should have withdrawn. Wasn't there a paladin there? Normally you should have left the matter to that person." As soon as this was said, Fred's anger immediately flared up. Fred said, "If we hadn't stepped in, the children would have died." Everyone was completely unexpected that Fred would actually argue back. Ramon was equally surprised, so he unconsciously took another look at Fred. It was this look that completely changed his opinion. He originally thought Fred was just a brat, but this expression was that of a complete beast. Fred continued, "Sir Gregory fought with all his might for the children, and the paladin also gave assurance. Rather than reprimand, they should be praised. Also, Fred wanted to say more but was interrupted by Joseph's shout. "Enough! Don't challenge my patience anymore." Seeing Joseph was angry, Fred hurriedly apologized. Joseph continued, "I believe in Sir Gregory's character, but rules are rules. So I announce that Knight Gregory will be suspended indefinitely. Knight Cade will also receive the same punishment. Finally, Attendant Fred, I also punish you with indefinite reflection, and don't appear before me until I summon you." At these words, Fred was completely stunned, but could only reluctantly accept. However, Joseph's disappointed look made Fred's mood very complicated. Just then, Ramon stopped Fred, who was feeling depressed. Out of politeness, Fred still bowed, then said, "I am Fred of Degia. May I know your distinguished name?" Fred appeared polite on the surface, but his eyes were glaring fiercely at Ramon. Ramon couldn't help but shiver. Then he grinned, and unfolded the banner covered with patterns, saying, "Unfortunately, I can't tell you my name now. After all, I walk the path of the lowest, and haven't fulfilled all my obligations yet." At these words, Fred was stunned. The word lowest deeply touched his heart. Time came to evening, and familiar sounds rang from the blacksmith shop. Inside, Fred was telling the blacksmith about Ramon's matter. The blacksmith just gave perfunctory responses because he was concentrating on repairing the sword. After some time, a brand new treasure sword was forged. So Fred prepared to leave with satisfaction, and promised to bring good wine and meat next time to thank him. After saying this, Fred turned and left. The back alley at night was very quiet and dark. Someone was following Fred behind. Although he tried his best to hide his presence, he was still detected by Fred. With just one turn, Fred disappeared, and had circled behind. Fred said, "Why are you following me?" Ramon said, "What are you talking about? I'm just walking my own path." Fred said, "Stop lying. I know you've been tracking me, and from our first meeting, you've been provoking me. If you have any dissatisfaction with me, you can tell me directly. No need to beat around the bush." Ramon smiled faintly and said, "Rather than words, I prefer to speak with swords." Seeing this situation, Fred no longer hesitated and charged forward with his sword, but was easily countered by Ramon. This was the difference in experience. Fred knew he couldn't match in swordsmanship, so he decisively activated his aura. This made Ramon stunned. He said, "Even in that chaotic era, few people could use such clear aura at this age. How exciting!" With that, the two grappled again, but this time Ramon was obviously struggling, so he also activated his aura, and instantly a silver aura emanated. Fred was very shocked, but Fred wasn't shocked that Ramon could use aura, but shocked that Ramon could attach the aura to his body, and the long sword he grasped couldn't be drawn. Even so what? Fred's title was Sanji's short sword. With that, Fred drew the short sword from his waist. He slashed with one sword, but Ramon dodged. After dodging, Ramon instinctively threw a punch. Fred was hit and flew backward directly. After Fred fell to the ground, Ramon realized he had done wrong. He hadn't noticed he used full force. Just as Ramon was thinking what to do, Fred suddenly opened his eyes, then quickly delivered a headbutt. But it was Fred who fell to the ground. It turned out Ramon had used aura to protect his head in time. The next day, Fred crawled up from bed covering his head, still cursing that damn old man. Just then, the door was kicked open. The person who came was Mina, carrying a pile of clothes. Fred said puzzledly, "Why are you washing clothes for me? Just leave them there, I'll wash them myself." After hearing this, Mina replied softly, "This is as it should be. You're our great hero. Thanks to you, those thugs don't dare act up in the inn. After all, you're a dignified knight." Fred quickly denied, "I'm not a knight yet." But before he finished speaking, Mina took out a handkerchief. She said, "In my view, you are a knight, and also Miss Alicia's knight. I even cut my hair to pass you the sword." Fred was about to explain, but Mina slammed the door and left. At evening, at the inn's dining hall, to show his apology, Ramon bought Fred a lot of delicious food. Fred ignored him and said coldly, "I don't accept your apology." Ramon was helpless. He said, "How about this, come with me to a place." Fred looked suspiciously at the old man before him. Ramon said, "Trust me, this time will definitely satisfy you." Fred could only reluctantly agree. The next day, the two followed a merchant caravan's cart to the grassland. Ramon also revealed the purpose of this trip, to catch a black horse that had become famous recently. Fred was very curious and was about to ask something, but was directly pushed down by Ramon. At the same moment, an arrow pierced straight into the cart's wooden board, but the others weren't so lucky and were directly killed by headshots. Then, a group of people emerged from the distance. Ramon's expression became somewhat grave after seeing them. It was actually barbarians, these kinds of guys. With a horn sound from the opposite side, all the barbarians immediately fired arrows in unison. The accompanying soldiers immediately used shields to block. Taking advantage of the two groups fighting, Ramon hurriedly thought of countermeasures. In his career, he had experienced this kind of battle countless times. There were many ways to defeat them, but the best method was to catch them off guard. So Ramon had Keith saddle the horse, then told Fred to cooperate with him later. As soon as he said it, Fred immediately released killing intent, stunning the opponents for 1 second. It was this 1 second that gave them time to charge. Ramon first activated his aura. With one horizontal sword sweep, none who were struck survived. The barbarians were also frightened by this scene and quickly turned to flee, but Fred had already arrived above them, also killing with one sword strike. But one person still got away. Just as Ramon was about to have Fred continue pursuing, the barbarian leader attacked but was blocked by Ramon in time. Facing this kind of leader, Ramon didn't take it lightly and directly activated his aura to fight. However, the leader seemed somewhat strong. He showed no sign of retreat. Seeing this, Ramon told Fred to quickly run and protect the others. Fred immediately turned and left upon receiving the order, but he was blocked by another barbarian. With the horse's assistance, Fred was actually pushed back several meters. Fred was also helpless about this. It would be great if he had a horse to ride. Just as he finished thinking this, a strong and powerful horse neigh came from the distance. Fred was stunned. This The sound was too familiar. Wasn't this that black horse?